Madam Chair, you're on mute.
I think I've actually listened to what you said. I'm so sorry about that. Thanks. All right, so good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to call to order the meeting of the Sentencing Guidelines Commission. The date is February 10th, 2021. We are 2022, actually. We're meeting by interactive technology today as permitted by Minnesota statute section 13D.021. And we're doing that because due to an ongoing health pandemic, access is restricted to our regular meeting location in the Centennial Office Building in St. Paul. And meeting in person is therefore not practical, prudent, or feasible for members of the commission, its staff, or the public. So that brings us to order. And Nate, if you would be so kind to call the roll for the commission, please.
Roll call. Estrada?
Present.
Estrada present. Blakey?
Present.
Blakey present. Hansi?
Present.
Hansi present. Knutson? Knutson absent. Ladd?
Present.
Ladd present. Larkin?
Present.
Larkin present. Middlebrook?
Present.
Middlebrook present. Moore?
Present.
Moore present. Morath?
Present.
Morath present. Schnell?
Present.
Schnell present. Chair Mitchell?
Present.
Chair Mitchell, there are present. Madam Chair, there are 10 members present, 1 member absent.
All right, thank you. We have a quorum for today. The first item is approval of the agenda, which was sent out to you last week, and I would entertain a motion to approve the agenda. Commissioner Middlebrook makes that motion. Do we have a second?
Second.
Commissioner Moore seconds. Nate, go ahead and call the roll.
To the Middlebrook motion to approve the agenda, Estrada?
Yes.
Estrada, yes. Blakey?
Yes.
Blakey, yes. Hansi?
Yes.
Hansi, yes. Knutson? Knutson absent. Ladd?
Yes.
Ladd present. Larkin? I'm sorry, Larkin, yeah. Ladd, yes. Excuse me. Larkin?
Yes.
Larkin, yes. Middlebrook?
Yes.
Middlebrook, yes. Moore?
Yes.
Moore, yes. Morath?
Yes.
Morath, yes. Schnell?
Yes.
Schnell, yes. Chair Mitchell?
Yes.
Chair Mitchell, yes. Madam Chair, there are 10 votes in favor, no votes opposed.
And with that, the agenda is approved unanimously. Next item on the agenda is approval of the draft meeting minutes from January 13th, 2022. Those were sent to you a week ago, so you hopefully have had an opportunity to review them, and I would entertain a motion to approve the minutes.
So moved.
Was that Commissioner Schnell?
Yes.
Okay, and do we have a second?
Second.
And Commissioner Estrada seconds. Any discussion? Hearing none, if you would call the vote on that, Nate.
To the Schnell motion to approve the January meeting minutes, Estrada?
Yes.
Estrada, yes. Blakey?
Yes.
Blakey, yes. Hansi?
Yes.
Hansi, yes. Knutson? Knutson absent. Ladd?
Yes.
Ladd, yes. Larkin?
Yes.
Larkin, yes. Middlebrook?
Yes.
Middlebrook, yes. Moore?
Yes.
Moore, yes. Morath?
Yes.
Morath, yes. Schnell?
Yes.
Schnell, yes. Chair Mitchell?
Yes.
Chair Mitchell, yes. Madam Chair, there are 10 votes in favor, no votes opposed.
And with that, the minutes are approved unanimously. All right, we have a lot on our agenda today, a lot of really interesting different topics today. The first item we're going to cover is the Governor's Council on Justice Reinvestment. The Council of State Governments is here to tell us a little bit more about what's been going on with that group. Carl Reynolds is going to be our speaker today. I'm going to hand it right over to him, and Carl can introduce himself, and he's got a guest with him here today as well. So take it away, Carl.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Nate's going to flip the slides for me. My name is Carl Reynolds, and my colleague Madeline Dardo is with me. We are both survivors of state government, Madeline in the state of Oregon and in the state of Alabama. And Madeline is down in Pensacola, Florida, by the way. I'm coming to you from Austin, Texas, where I'm retired from state government as well. So we are both in a little bit sunnier climes than you all. So my apologies for that. And I hope we get through this winter. I came to you back in November and gave a pretty brief update or briefing on the Justice Reinvestment Initiative. And now here we are in February and prepared to give you quite a bit more information. I'm gonna move briskly, but I certainly don't mind if anyone has a question and wants to interrupt, or you can wait until the end, whatever is good for you all. And as I said, Nate's gonna flip the slides, and I'm ready for slide 2, Nate. So one unique feature of our project in Minnesota is that there are 2 different working groups that have related but distinct responsibilities in this project. The Governor's Council on Justice Reinvestment, which is kind of the title that Madam Chair queued this up under, is a 15-member group. And in fact, the Chair and Commissioner Schnell are members of the Governor's Council on Justice Reinvestment. And I'll show you the membership of that group at the very end of this presentation, just to give you a more of an idea of who that is. The Delivery System Working Group is more of a practitioner-focused effort. The people who are running probation departments around the state, the folks at the DOC who are involved in the supervision aspect of the system in particular, county commissioners, folks like that. And so the Governor's Council is kind of a distilled version of the Delivery System Working Group, but also has 4 legislators on it. And the Governor's Council is organized under the statutory authority for the governor to use executive orders to create 15-member groups. And so it is one of those 15-member groups. Go ahead, Nate. I think you skipped one, Nate, if I'm not mistaken. Sorry, I am mistaken. House File 63 that passed last summer and had the budget for the Department of Corrections as well as the budget for the Sentencing Commission set up this Delivery System Working Group. And it really is kind of a continuation of a group that we had been meeting with, we, the Council of State Governments, over the last, I guess, year and a half or so. Along with Commissioner Schnell, we received some federal funding to work with this group of practitioners sorting through the budgetary issues that the state was facing at the time, and in particular, how the state might be able to preserve funding for community supervision at a time when it was looking as though there were going to be deep cuts in the budget. That, of course, didn't happen, but it did give us an opportunity to really understand the personalities and some of the issues in Minnesota quite a bit better. And it led to this creation of the House File 63 Delivery System Working Group with this mandate that I'm showing you on the screen. Is kind of a boiled down version of what the bill actually instructed us to try to do, which has come up with a proposal for funding of the community supervision systems, begin to define core standards in accordance with the state's obligation to oversee that delivery system, and a plan for tribal government supervision for people on probation or post-release supervision. This is probably a reminder for everyone, but I wanted to make sure you all are familiar with the fact that Minnesota is unique in its delivery of supervision services, in that counties in the state have 3 different choices for how they carry out the supervision of people in the criminal justice system. Community Corrections Act agencies provide most of the supervision in the state. 71% of all the people on probation are in CCA counties or CCA agencies. And so that means that the entire workload, if you will, of doing supervision is turned over to the CCA. The opposite of that is when the state takes over the entire workload. And that's sort of the default option in state law, the Department of Corrections providing all probation services. And as it turns out, about 18% of folks on adult probation in the state are in DOC run agencies. And then there's a middle option. This is what's, I think, most unique about Minnesota is the option spelled out in statute 244.19 of having what is referred to as a CPO county, a county probation officer approach, which is, as I say, sort of the middle ground. Instead of doing everything or nothing, the county actually sets up a system that provides supervision for juveniles and adults who are convicted of misdemeanors and gross misdemeanors. The felony stuff, the felony probation and back end supervision is all handled by the DOC in those counties. So they kind of split the supervision duties in CPO counties. Go ahead, Nate. So as you could see from the House File 63 mandate, a big part of what we've been looking at is the way that these systems are funded. And one of the things we learned from the National Association of State Budget Officers is that Minnesota has spent the lowest proportion of state general funds on corrections of all the states. And I think you would see that that's probably true year in and year out. It is true for the last year that NASBO created their report. And I would mostly attribute that to the fact that you've had sentencing guidelines for many, many years. And those guidelines have essentially controlled the size of your prison population in a way that some states do not have control. And I think that obviously the most expensive part of any correction system is the part where people are being housed and fed and taken care of medically and so forth at fairly great expense per person. And so the smaller size of your prison system has helped to maintain that small budget for corrections. We also think that the state is frankly underinvesting in the supervision part of the system. And I think, and so that's one reason to bring out this point about the budget. And so the way the state does that is actually through 3 or 4 different mechanisms or funding streams that carry out the system. There's a CCA formula, which is a fairly complex formula based on objective factors that are listed in 401.10 of the Minnesota statutes. The CPO county budgets or county subsidies are defined in 244.19 and then in a separate statute that's escaping me, 244.20 or so, that was developed in the 90s as a way to boost the funding that the state provides to CPO counties. But the state has never, frankly, lived up to its statutory obligation. I say never, hasn't in many years lived up to its statutory obligation to fund the amount that is called for in statute for the CPO counties. And then there's the way that the state provides supervision itself, which is an appropriation to DOC. These are all appropriations to DOC. And that's, kind of an internal bureaucratic way of figuring out where resources are needed, where new agents are needed, and so forth. So those are the 3 or 4 different ways in which supervision is funded. And so the observation is this is really complicated. It's uneven, it's complex, it's difficult for policymakers and everybody else to understand how this all works. So one of our goals has been to try to come up with a way to simplify that. And one of the things that we found, the 4th and 5th bullets here, are that there's a lot of variation. The amount that the state is spending county by county, and definitely the amount that different counties are putting into this supervision system has a lot of variation. And but even given the variation, one thing you can say is that counties are spending more money on this approach than the state is, and disproportionately so. So the next slide actually illustrates those last 2 points. So what this is showing you is per capita spending for supervision in just the counties, just the CCA agencies. We had better data about the budgets of CCA agencies, and so that's why we're showing you just this subset of all the agencies in the state. But the light blue is an indication of the county share of that funding, of that expenditure, and then the darker color blue or whatever that is the state share. And each of the bars is adding up to a per capita amount of funding. So in other words, the agency spends X amount of money during the year and is supervising Y people, X divided by Y divided by 365 gives you a per capita amount of funding. And so you can see that those vary from $3 roughly to $13 roughly in different agencies. And the proportion that the county is spending of that total sum varies pretty widely as well. A couple of counties that are spending less than half of the money that's being spent, but most counties spending well over half, and even in the case of the top one, 84% of the money that's being spent. So wild variation. And just so you know, these per diem expenditures, $3 to $13, that's somewhere in there is what every supervision system, I believe, spends to deal with people under supervision. We've looked at the amount of state money that is being spent here in Texas, where I am, in Pennsylvania, where I've been doing some work on a similar project having to do with the state funding local supervision, Kansas, Oregon, the different states that we've looked at as reference points for Minnesota. All their numbers are in this range of $3 to $13. Oregon, I can't remember if I mentioned Oregon to you all in November, but Oregon is the state that I tended to really hone in on in this process, because they do a very an elaborate workload study every 6 years to develop their own understanding of what it costs to supervise all the people in the state, which is done at the county level. Back in the 90s, Oregon decided they were going to commit to spending the amount of money that it takes to actually supervise all these folks. And their per diem rate that the state is funding in what I would call a fully funded state supervision, fully state funded system that's run at the local level, roughly $12 a day, $12+ a day is their overall capitated rate, as they refer to it. So all these rates are kind of in the same ballpark. Next slide, Nate. We also, my colleague David Demora, who is a longtime expert in our field, did a fairly elaborate assessment, a whole series of interviews with people in the system, people who are running probation agencies, agents at the line level who handle supervision, and people who are on supervision, having conversations, 80 different conversations or more that Madeline and I and other members of our team were able to sit in on, but that David conducted. So a very concerted effort to get a qualitative feel for what's going on in not just in the different supervision systems, but agency by agency. And no surprise, really, these are some of the big findings of that work. That there are inconsistent assessment tools and risk and needs assessments being used. None of the instruments have been validated for the Minnesota population, and assessments are not strictly tied to the way that case planning is being conducted. And that's a best practice, that those two things actually kind of go hand in hand. Number two, no big surprise, the people that are doing supervision don't look like the people who are under supervision. In other words, the proportion of people who are Black and Native American in your system is much higher than the proportion of those people who are actually conducting supervision, who are mostly white. Number three, there is a lack of consistent coaching and quality assurance for supervision officers. Number four, no surprise, community programs vary in quality and availability. And number five has to do with the people, the entities that are providing services that aren't the supervision folks, the contract treatment provider, for example. A lot of inconsistency in how providers are asked to do their work, how they report back on what's going on with folks, how they're doing or not doing services that really fit the needs of the criminal justice population, and so on. Go ahead, Nate. This is just a quick summary of who David visited with. We tried to make sure that we touched all the different delivery systems and the geography of the state, big and large places and so forth. So these are the actual counties that that David interacted with, either the folks that work there or the folks who were on supervision in those places. Go ahead. if you ever wanted to have a one-page summary of what works in supervision, this is kind of David's version of boiling that all down to 9 points. And it's the framework under which he conducted his work and wrote up his results to provide to the supervisors in the system, and to help us frame in longer presentations the ideas and both the findings that he reached and the policy recommendations that he arrived at under these 9 different points. I won't read through them, but this is a great summary of what it takes to do modern effective correctional supervision. Go ahead, Nate. So at some point, someone said, hey, "Can you kind of boil all this down? There's a lot of recommendations you've come up with. What would be the the top 4 if we really wanted to try to take this on and do what we can do in the short term? What are the things that rise to the top?" And these are those: getting to the point of using one set of tools that's validated on the Minnesota population. So LSCMI is the prevailing tool in Minnesota, but other variations are being used. And there are other off-the-shelf tools like the ORAS and so forth. But there's no sort of center of gravity on those. And there are ways to, even if the state never reaches the point of everybody using the same tools, there are ways to kind of map the results of those tools to each other. And that would be sort of the fallback position for this, is so that people are speaking the same language about the risk and needs of the folks who are under supervision. Because people do end up being supervised by different agencies, being convicted of crimes in different places, and having overlapping supervision, or even a supervision that ends one place and begins someplace else, folks going in and out of prison and so forth, moving from system to system. So you need a common language and understanding of what the risks and needs are, so that you can deliver the right resources to folks. And number 2, as I mentioned, these assessment tools have to be tied to a case planning process, and that's not happening consistently or in the same way across different kinds of systems. Number 3, David really seized on the idea that it would be great to have a team or a person who is really working on all of this work consistently over time, having a statewide evidence-based practice coordinator, helping to enhance the statewide training that can be provided, supporting coaching and so forth. So a way to, sort of a soft way to bring consistency to a system that has these different components. And by the way, I meant to mention this earlier. We did not recommend that the state dissolve the 3 different ways of doing of delivering supervision. I think what we're coming around to is a single way to fund supervision, but not taking away that choice of 3 different models that counties have. That would stay in place. But again, these are things that you can overlay on this system that would improve the quality, improve the results of the system. Number 4, requiring evidence-based treatment approaches for clients in the criminal justice system. Again, this is directed to the community providers that probation agencies are referring people to and getting people back from, requiring more rigor of the folks that are providing those kinds of services to people in the justice system. Go ahead, Dave. Now, the third piece, you'll recall, was the tribal supervision piece. And candidly, we did not get very far on this topic, and in part because the fellow who worked for the Department of Corrections, whose job it was to coordinate tribal stuff, passed away from COVID during the last few months. And so that kind of put a hold on all kinds of things. And so that we also, frankly, had difficulty literally engaging with the tribes in this virtual environment. It's just not conducive with cultures that really kind of demand a lot of face-to-face time and getting to know each other and so forth. So did not get too far on this, but we did do a lot of data analysis, and I'll show you one example of that in a moment. Looking at something that I know the Sentencing Commission has looked at over time, and I've heard the chair talk about this with Sentencing Commission folks around the country, the fact that Native American and Black people are overrepresented in all the justice populations, in probation, supervised release, and prison populations, pretty massively overrepresented. in all those populations. Because of the geography of the state and where the Department of Corrections provides supervision, the DOC has the largest proportion of Native American clients. And the flip side of that is not listed here, but CCA counties, which tend to be the more urban places, the CCA statute requires that a county be at least 30,000 to even be in the CCA system, or combine with other counties to reach a critical mass of 30,000. So by its very nature, the more urban areas, Hennepin, Ramsey, and so forth, are CCA counties, and the larger proportion of Black people are under supervision in those agencies. We did some, I'm going to show you in a second, some recidivism analysis that was done using regression so that you can hold constant variables that make people uncomparable and compare apples to apples, if you will. And sure enough, we saw that reconviction rates, reincarceration rates, the different measures of recidivism that we used that we could see in the data were higher for Native American and Black people in the system. And finally, we certainly think and want to pursue the idea that Minnesota can eliminate some barriers and work with tribal leaders and move towards a system where tribes are able to opt into a funding supply from the state, if you will, and provide supervision themselves should they choose to do that. Go ahead, Nate. So this is some results of the regression analysis that I was referring to. So these are looking at people who are similarly situated, similar offenses, and so forth, and reaching conclusions about what's happening to them. So Native American people, this is rates of what's happening to people compared to white people as a 1.0 rate, right? The sort of baseline. So Native American people are 1.4 times more likely to be reconvicted of a felony if they are on felony probation. If they're on misdemeanor probation, they're 1.5 times more likely to have any kind of new probation within 3 years of that start date. Similarly, for Black people on felony probation, 1.2 times more likely to be reconvicted, and 1.3 times more likely to have a new probation term when they were on misdemeanor probation. So the sort of easy comparisons that you see in a system like Minnesota's, and frankly in every system in the United States that I know of, where you're saying, there's a disproportionate number of people who are Black in prison or Native American in prison or on probation. Those kind of easy comparisons shake out to be true even using regression analysis, where this relative proportion of what's happening to people is higher for folks of color, essentially. We were compelled to submit a report by February 1st by House File 63. Actually, House File 63 said December 15th, and somewhere along the line we got some mercy and were able to put that back until February 1st. But the report outlines pretty much all the information I've given you and more, and frames a set of policy options under these 8 line items here. Ensuring that counties are equitably funded, and that's where this idea of a single method of funding supervision comes into play. Ensuring effectiveness and equity across the systems, and so forth. I don't want to read this to you. Chair Mitchell has this report. I don't think I supplied this to Nate, but if you want to see our whole report from February 1st, either I can send it to Nate or the chair could provide that to you, unless that's already happened. I don't know. But if you're interested to read more about what's kind of within each of these 8 points, that's what's spelled out in the February 1 report. Next slide, Nate. And a big piece of that, this slide and the next couple of slides are about the investments that we are suggesting that the state should provide. And as I said at the outset, we certainly perceive that Minnesota is underfunding supervision in its system. And again, just compare to Oregon, which is funding supervision at $12 a day, and the state's paying for all of that. In Minnesota, it varies wildly, and the counties are paying most of it. So we really felt like we needed to come up with some recommendations about how the state could more richly provide funding, not so that counties can back out of what they're doing because the system needs to get better across the board, but so that can happen. And these are the rough amounts that we've depicted in our study. An upfront investment of $25 million in this next supplemental budget, and then in the subsequent budget, an additional investment of $38 million, and that would be split between mostly formula-driven funding under line item 1 in this depiction, but also the ideas in 2 and 3. 2 is having this statewide quality assurance training and coaching team with the $2 million price tag, and also having the ability to set up regional caseloads that are intended to supervise people who are struggling under supervision, who are at risk of being revoked, being housed in prison, and one step that can be taken in lieu of that, in between regular supervision and ending up behind bars, is having specialized caseloads and empowering the state with resources to set up those kinds of revocation or pre-revocation caseloads would be another tool in the toolbox. So the formula that we came up with for this first round of investment, the $25 million in this budget year, the principles that drove those thoughts were that regardless of the system, there needs to be increased capacity to implement effective community supervision. There's not enough people doing the work to do it well uniformly, and you just need to build up the capacity of the system, more boots on the ground, more ability to provide supervision to people. And that goes to the second point as well, that you need additional workforce. You've got all these different subpopulations under supervision and with varying risk and need levels. And the thought is that the state ought to be really targeting beefing up that system across the board to achieve better public safety outcomes. But there's also the idea, number 3, of a shared responsibility. We did not, we haven't said, you need to do exactly what Oregon's doing and pay for all of this yourself, state of Minnesota. There is a value and a history to local control in Minnesota, and the idea that counties have this choice about how they want to deliver supervision, and judges and the folks at the local level need to have a say in what that looks like, place by place. But the state again needs to step up and provide more funding to make sure that can happen successfully. Next slide, please, Nate. One back. It looks very similar, Nate, but this is the principles that would guide the out years, the tail, if you will, of coming up with this single funding mechanism. And the idea in number 2 here is doing a rigorous workload study like Oregon does, and like the Department of Corrections does already for its folks, and like your judicial branch does as well. Your judicial branch was the first in the country to do a statewide workload assessment with the National Center for State Courts back in 2008, I believe. Well known for that, and so there's nothing new about this idea for Minnesota. Your child welfare agency has actually embarked on some kind of a workload study for caseworkers in that system. So this is nothing new, but the idea is that should be the way that the state figures out how much it's going to take to do a good job of supervising all these people across the state, and funding it according to capitated rates that fit the types of people that are under supervision, the different levels of supervision, misdemeanor versus coming out of prison, and different risks and needs within those different subgroups of people. Next slide, please. So I alluded to this earlier. This is the actual membership of the Governor's Council. Senator Rosen and Kevin Reese are the chairs. That's why they're circled in red. As you can see, Commissioner Schnell, Chair Mitchell are on the group, and you can see that there are 4 legislators and so forth. So this is the group that we've been meeting with in kind of a frantic way, frankly, and we have another meeting with this group tomorrow to talk through and kind of gut check the ideas that we've presented to the group on February 1st in the report. And we have another meeting next Friday, a week from tomorrow, to continue that discussion and try to arrive at a place where we feel like there's a consensus and where the folks in the legislature can feel as though this is some work that some smart people have looked at and decided about and hopefully take up some actions both in statute and appropriations that will see this through. And should that happen, we, the Council of State Governments, will be privileged to hang around some more, probably not me, but probably Madeline and other people helping to do some implementation. We refer to this as phase 2 of justice reinvestment, where when a state takes some policy steps to improve the system, we get an additional dose of federal funding, if you will, to be able to spend more time with the folks in the state. And frankly, I think we would spend that time with a group that looks like the Delivery System Working Group. We've proposed it as a Justice Reinvestment Implementation Commission. And in fact, the idea for what that would look like came from the statute that defines your commission. So that we'll see if that plays out. But our implementation notion is it's not the same exact roles that you all occupy in your commission, but a similar size, body, and approach in statute that would create an ongoing effort to implement all these kinds of changes, which is going to be a lot of work. I think that leads me to the timeline. Right in the middle of this timeline is the beginning of session, the February 1 deadline that I mentioned that has been delivered. And hopefully we get through session and get some things done, both in the appropriations process and in statute, and begin that implementation process in the spring. And this is contact information for Michelle Rodriguez, who is the sort of mastermind of our project in terms of keeping us organized and keeping the plate spinning. Michelle actually, as we just found out, is going on maternity leave in April. So feel free to email me or Madeline. My email is creynolds@csg.org. And Nate and Madam Chair and Commissioner Schnell certainly know how to find us. But that is all I had to deliver. I'm happy to see if I can answer any questions.
All right, thanks, Carl. First of all, I want to recognize that Commissioner Knudsen has joined us. He came online partway through your presentation. So if we could note his presence for the record, Nate, that would be great.
Madam Chair, if I could, I somehow unfortunately ended up in the attendee room instead of the panel room. And as Nate was calling roll, I was trying to unmute myself, but of course you can't unmute yourself in the attendee room. So I apologize if the record could reflect that I vote aye on the agenda and the minutes.
Perfect. I'm sorry that happened. I'm glad you're here though. Okay, so we have a few minutes for questions. I'm going to take the privilege to ask the first one, and then I'll open it up for anyone else. Carl, like when you were talking about the budget and the per diem, one thing that I was curious about is, does that take into account money that is spent on services for people who are on supervision, or is that accounted for another way?
It does not. It's a great question, and it typically would not. It is funding for the delivery of supervision itself. We are trying to get our arms around what's happening with behavioral health funding in Minnesota, and certainly want to make sure that that part of your state government and local government is attuned to the needs of the people in the criminal justice system, and that the two systems collaborate. That is always a challenge in our field. But the simple answer is no, it does not.
So did you do anything to try to get a sense of whether this sort of same, not disparity, like there's differences, right, in the county contribution across the state for supervision? were you able to tell if there may also be differences in the level of services that are available as well?
Certainly anecdotally through
Okay.
David's work in the interviews, but not in a dollar comparison sort of way. I would love to have been able to really delve deeply into the way that behavioral health dollars play out in the state, but honestly did not have time to do that.
All right. I forgot to mention this too, Carl. If you would just send the report to Nate, he can share that with the rest of the commission. That'd be great.
Happy to.
Are there other commission members who have questions or comments? Commissioner Moore.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Reynolds, thank you for your presentation. This is really interesting. I was a judge in a Rural Community Corrections Act jurisdiction before coming here, and I was really taken aback, frankly, by the slide that shows the differences per diem in county contributions in CCA counties. I mean, that's really a extraordinary difference. And I'm wondering, did you identify any of the reasons for this? Were these decisions made at the, I guess what I'm trying to delve down into, were these local decisions or were these state imposed problems? What reasons were behind these differences?
That's a great question, Justice Moore. I think they're local decisions, essentially. The state funding for community corrections is formula driven. And so it's looking at the same set of factors for each jurisdiction and coming up with, relatively comparable amounts of money based on the volume of people in the jurisdiction, the taxing capability of the jurisdiction, and so forth. So it's really a matter of local decisions about how much effort and resources to put into that system. And I was frankly surprised at that range as well.
Commissioner Estrada.
Thank you for the presentation. I was actually part of the focal group in Hennepin County and meeting with our area director on March 4th to discuss, I think, a 61-page report that was provided to us for recommendations. I'm wondering, as I kind of remember what that conversation was, you mentioned a couple of things about, some people are implementing, or some agencies may be implementing case planning or have more evidence-based practices. Were you able to see if in locations where it may not be implemented, if there was a desire to implement it, and if it was just a lack of funding that was preventing it, or were you finding that people were just resistant to it and it wasn't even on the radar?
A great question, Commissioner, and I'm going to relate to you what David, who really did the bulk of that work, what he related to us and to our delivery system working group in particular, was encountering supervision officers across the state, many of whom were all in on evidence-based practices and were up on it, knew what they were doing, had a sort of coaching mentality, if you will. But there were some old school folks as well that had more of a, the old nail 'em and jail 'em kind of mentality about how to do supervision. So there was some of that as well. And again, the need to kind of lift the bar for everybody and make sure that folks across the board are doing this work in the best way possible, because probation systems are the best hope for criminal justice, for changing folks' behavior, for changing recidivism and keeping people from being locked up, which sometimes is necessary, but is often not very helpful in terms of what's going to happen to those folks down the line. So did see that kind of variation, but for the most part, David was very complimentary of the people in the system that he encountered who were doing the work.
And just to add to Carl's point as well, I think another thing that David will tell you is that where folks aren't able to implement those evidence-based practices, and sometimes that's due to resource, just not having the resource to be able to do the things that they know are the right things to do and that they want to do.
Right, or get the training that they need to do it because they're swamped in a caseload.
Any other questions or comments? Commissioner Moore.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Reynolds, I wanted to ask you another question. Are you familiar with another state that has this type of, tripartite correction structure like Minnesota does?
Justice Moore, it is unique, but there is another state that it reminds me of, and that is Kansas, where we did some work and are still working actually. Now a different team of people, but Kansas has a system where they have sentencing guidelines very much like Minnesota's, and a disposition sort of line and so forth. A very, very similar sentencing structure to Minnesota's, and the same idea of fairly determinate sentencing where people get out and have post-release supervision. But the way that they deliver front-end supervision is they have a group called Community Corrections, and that is funded through the State Department of Corrections, much like yours is. But they also have a totally separate judicial branch funded group of people who supervise folks at the lower end of the spectrum, if you will. And by that I mean people who they do statewide consistent risk and needs assessment on everybody. And folks that fall at the low end of the risk and needs spectrum are put under supervision. And I'm blanking on the name of that system, but it's run by the judiciary at the state level, and it's run by the judiciary at the local level. And then community corrections takes the folks that are on supervision who present higher risks and needs. And then at the back end of the system, when people get out of prison, there's a fully state-run kind of traditional parole type function. So they have 3 different groups of folks doing supervision there. It's just divided a little differently.
It seemed to me from my experience that one of the problems with our system is, people who are being supervised inconsistently in different jurisdictions, and frankly floating or moving between different jurisdictions in kind of an I got it, you take it type of capacity. And it sort of seemed to me that there were some obvious significant differences in resources and methodology for supervision, and the lack of consistency, I think, created a lot of cracks that offenders could fall into, frankly. And then what would ultimately end up in recidivism, probation revocations, and generally a recommendation for a prison commit. And I always wondered in those circumstances, whether overworked probation agents in multiple jurisdictions were really able to effectively supervise a person in those circumstances.
Yeah, it's a great observation. And as I said, we didn't recommend the dissolution of the tripartite delivery system, but we do think you can overlay a lot of consistency and best practice on any kind of system. Frankly, as David would say, it doesn't matter if you have 10 different delivery systems. You've got to do this sort of set of 9 things consistently, no matter who's doing it. And we think that can be achieved. We did see in the data people that were under supervision in multiple places, sometimes by different delivery systems, sometimes by just different counties or whatever. But that certainly does happen in a fraction of the cases.
All right, well, in the interest of time, we will need to move on to the next item on our agenda. Thanks so much to Carl and Madeline for coming today and presenting this information. And hopefully you'll help keep the commission up to date as things sort of move on and some of the final recommendations are made to the legislature.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks. All right, so the next item on the agenda is the 2020 sentencing data presentation. Long awaited. Normally we get it in November, but 2020 was a weird year, so it took a little longer this time. I'm going to hand it over to Nate and the staff to go through that.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm trying to share. So I guess my question for you is, can you see a full screen presentation at this time?
No, we're seeing your notes.
Oh, you're seeing the notes. Okay.
We're seeing your notes view, yeah.
All right. Well, still notes view. All right, we'll try something else.
Yeah.
Okay. So bear with me, please. Huh.
There's a setting under slideshow that says use presenter view. If you unclick that, it might.
Well, yeah, and I kind of need presenter view, so
Oh,
it's just, I've got 3 screens I'm juggling and it's,
oh, I see.
and I don't want my, yeah, I think this will work.
You got to get the right one up there then, right?
Yeah, I don't want my, pop-up messages interfering with the show, but this should be getting closer. Okay. I'm
you
hoping you can see my full screen presentation, right?
Yes, that's right.
So thank you, Madam Chair. As you said, this presentation normally occurs earlier. We typically finalize our sentencing data in the middle of the following year. It takes us a while to make sure we've got all the departure information and everything ready to finalize. Because of work demands and short staff, we did not get that done until pretty late in 2021. So what we're presenting to you in 2022 is the 2020 sentencing data report. And we'll begin with Jill.
Okay, thank you, Nate. With the first slide, thank you. Minnesota courts sentenced 11,517 felony cases in 2020. This was a 34% decrease from 2019. And this is also the lowest case volume since 2001, when felony cases were below 11,000. All offense categories decreased in 2020 as a proportion of all cases sentenced, and focusing on the big 3. Person offenses accounted for 32%, property 25%, drugs 28%, and all other offense categories accounted for 3 to 5% of cases sentenced. Excuse me. As mentioned in the last slide, case volume fell by more than 30% in 2020. This is assumed to be due in large part to the effect of the COVID pandemic. Therefore, 2020 data are considered unreliable to use for comparison. Unlike a typical data presentation, this year's avoids analysis of data trends. Data from prior years are reported not to illustrate long-term trends, but to place this unique year in context with prior year's trends. Recently, the courts reported on initiatives to clear the major criminal case backlog by 20% every 4 months until the backlog is eliminated, which they estimate will be in June of 2023. This slide illustrates the 34% drop in the number of cases from 2019 to 2020. Before that, there was a 5% drop from 2018 to 2019. And before that, you can see a 7-year run of annual percent increases from 2010 to 2017. This slide shows the percent change we saw in the last slide by offense type. The darker the shading, the larger the level of change. Greens are decreases and blues are increases. In 2020, the decreases ranged from 22% to 39%. And again, focusing on the big 3 categories, the person category dropped 27.1%, property was down 38.9%, and drugs were down 38%. As mentioned in the last slide, there were drops in 2019 as well. Notably, drug offenses were down for the first time since 2010. Distribution by gender over time has remained fairly constant, where in 2020, the male percentage was 82.2% and the female percentage was 17.8%. In 2019, the female percentage was slightly higher at 19.6%, and in 2018, the female percentage was 20.3%, which is the only year females accounted for more than 20% of cases. This slide shows the race and ethnicity of people sentenced from 1981 through 2020. The white percentage decreased by 25 points between 1981 and 2009. This was largely due to an increase in the Black percentage, although the percentages of other races or ethnicities also increased. Of those sentenced in 2020, 56.6% were white, 26% were Black, 9.2% were American Indian, 5.3% were Hispanic, and 2.7% were Asian. And this is similar to the distribution in recent years. This figure displays the distribution of race and ethnicity by Minnesota's 10 judicial districts. The districts with the largest Black percentages were the 2nd district, which is Ramsey County, and the 4th district, which is Hennepin County. Those who are Black accounted for over half the people sentenced in the 4th district, at 53.7%, and almost half the people sentenced in the 2nd district, at 48.7%. Those who are American Indian comprised a larger share of people sentenced in the 6th, 7th, and 9th districts. The districts with the largest share of those who are Hispanic are in the 3rd, 5th, and 8th districts. And the district with the largest percentage of those who are Asian is in the 2nd district. Okay, next we have Nate, who will talk about incarceration rates.
Thanks, Jill. And I should have introduced you to those who are not familiar. That was Senior Research Analysis Jill Payne. She's one of our 2 Senior Research Analysis Specialists that we have on staff. This figure displays the incarceration rates over time. The top line is the total incarceration rate, which is the sum of the other 2 lines. The middle line, that green line, is the conditional confinement rate, or the rate at which people go to jail. And the bottom line, the light blue line, is the imprisonment rate. So that's the rate at which people at their initial sentencing event are sentenced to executed prison terms. So that's, you add those 2 up and you get that top blue line. We also have a 4th line on here, which is the presumptive prison rate. That's the line that you have control over as the Sentencing Guidelines Commission. That's the line at which people are presumed under the sentencing guidelines to go to prison based on the combination of essentially 3 factors: the severity of the offense, the criminal history score of the offender, and any policies such as mandatory minimums that may impact that decision. This isn't talking about how long people go to prison or jail. We'll talk about that in a minute. This is just talking about the decision to go to prison or the decision to go to jail. In 2020, the total incarceration rate, so the sum of both of those numbers, was almost 90%, a slight decrease from 2019. 67.3% served time, 67.3% of the total served time in a local correctional facility as part of their stayed sentence, and 22.6% were sentenced to a DOC prison facility. So let's talk about that 22.6% number. While the imprisonment rate has risen since the start of the guidelines era, the rate was under 20% in 1982. The percentage of felony cases receiving executed prison sentences has generally remained fairly stable over time. And you can see that on this long timeline that goes back to 1982. It reached a peak of 27.4% in 2013, but I would say that it's now fallen back to levels that we saw in the decade of the 2000s. Again, 22.6% is consistent with what you might have seen in that decade. It was a bit higher in the 2010s, but I would say that overall it's been fairly stable in the low to mid 20s since almost the beginning of the guidelines era. By contrast, the presumptive prison rate has been on a fairly steady march upward since the guidelines began. Again, that's the dashed brown line. That's the line that you have direct control over. In 2020, the sentencing guidelines recommended imprisonment in a record 35.5% of the cases sentenced. The difference between the presumptive prison rate and the actual prison rate of 12.9 percentage points. So we can just zoom in on this. So that that 12.9 percentage point difference was easily the largest difference between the actual and presumptive prison rate on record. And that may be in large part due to the anomalous nature of 2020 as a year, but I will point out that the second highest rate, that what had been the record, was last year's record, a difference of 10.4 percentage points. And it does seem to be consistent with a trend that those two lines seem to be dividing, if you will. Unpacking all the reasons between the rising imprisonment rate and the rising disparity between the imprisonment rate and the actual sentencing rate would be a very interesting future research topic if the commission were interested in exploring that further. When comparing imprisonment rates by gender, race, and ethnicity, it's important to note that much of the variation is directly related to the proportion of offenders in any particular group who are recommended a prison sentence by the sentencing guidelines based on the severity of the offense and the offender's criminal history, which is why on these next two charts, we show you the presumptive imprisonment rate in addition to the actual imprisonment rate. So the actual imprisonment rate is reflected by the blue bar at the bottom. That's the percentage of people who got prison at their initial sentencing event. And I say that because they might eventually get prison, even if they're in the green line or the uncolored line above that. They might eventually get prison if they're revoked, if their probation is revoked. But the 22.6% at the bottom total is reflective of what happened when they were first sentenced. Observed imprisonment rates have always been higher for males, and local rates have always been higher for females. In 2020, 25% of males received prison sentences compared to 9% of females. As we said, that the total incarceration rate was 88.9%. That varied across different races. Just zeroing in on prison rate, the Asian group was imprisoned at the lowest rate, 18.1%, whereas the Black group were imprisoned at the highest rate, the 27.7%. Variation was also observed in incarceration rates, and this is not new this year. Variation was also observed by Minnesota Judicial District. And there is a map at the end of the slides of the judicial districts. The second district in Ramsey County had the highest total incarceration rate, 98.8%. So that's the prison and the jail combined. And the ninth in Northwest Minnesota had the lowest total incarceration rate at 81.4%. The second and ninth district had the highest imprisonment rates at 24.4% and 28.1%. And the sixth district had the lowest imprisonment rate at 18.1%. This slide shows the average pronounced confinement durations over time in months for prison sentences. That's the top line. And in days for local confinement, that's the bottom line. So you got two different axes going on. You can look to the left to see the months and look to the right to see the days. The average pronounced prison sentence in 2020 was 50.6 months. That's an increase from 2019 when it was 48.4 months. So to look at the number of people actually going to prison or the impact on prison, it's important to kind of keep both of these concepts in mind. What is the imprisonment rate and how long are the people going for? And in this case, it's definitely been rising for some time. We're not quite up to those record peaks of 2003 and 1994, but we're definitely approaching it. And 50.6 months is definitely higher than 48.4 months, which is what we saw in 2019. On the other hand, the average amount of local confinement seems to be on a steady drift downward. 90 days was the lowest duration of local confinement that we've seen. I'm going to be now followed by our other senior research analysis specialist, Ann Wall.
Hello, everyone. We will now look at departures from the recommended guideline sentence. 72% of all cases in 2020 received the presumptive guideline sentence. The remaining 28% received some type of departure, 24.6 mitigated and 1.4 aggravated. So the total departure rate was 24.6%. The total departure rate was higher in 2019 at 26.3%. Next. This slide focuses on dispositional departures. That's a departure from the recommended prison or probation disposition. In 2020, the combined mitigated and aggravated dispositional departure rate was approximately 15%, and almost all of it was mitigated. That is probation when the guidelines recommend prison. 0.06% got an aggravated disposition, that is prison when the guidelines recommended probation. Effective with the August 1, 2015 amendments to the sentencing guidelines, a sentence that is executed pursuant to a defendant's right to demand execution is no longer considered departure. This change has resulted in a decrease in the aggravated dispositional departure rate from previous years. In 2015, the overall aggravated dispositional departure rate was 4.2%, and the rate for presumptive stage sentences was 6.2%. In 2020, the decrease in aggravated dispositional departure rates is fully apparent. This slide, we see the total mitigated dispositional rate of 43%, shown by the line going across the screen. And we note the offenses for which the offenses with the highest mitigated dispositional departure rates in 2020. Again, that is when a person is recommended prison, but they receive probation. The overall mitigated rate was 43%, was the highest rate ever seen since the guidelines went into effect. And 2019 had the second highest rate at 39%. These rates vary by offense. The mitigated dispositional rate was 50% or more for second-degree assault, domestic assault, failure to register as a predatory offender, controlled substance crime in the 5th degree, and felony DWI. Second-degree assault and failure to register have statutory mandatory minimums, but also statutory provisions that allow for sentencing without regard to the minimum. In all offense categories, amenability to probation or treatment were the most frequently cited substantial and compelling reasons for departure. In 65% of all mitigated dispositional departures, the court stated that the prosecutor agreed to the departure, recommended the departure, or did not object to departure. In 16% of these cases, the court stated that the prosecutor objected to the departure. Okay, 19% of the cases, the court didn't supply information on the position of the prosecutor. Now we're going to turn to durational departure. A durational departure occurs when the court orders a sentence with a duration that is other than the presumptive fixed duration or the range in the appropriate cell on the applicable grid. There are two types of durational departures, aggravated and mitigated. An aggravated durational departure occurs when the court pronounces a duration that is more than 20% higher than the fixed duration on the grid. A mitigated duration occurs when the court pronounces a sentence that is more than 15% lower than the fixed duration on the grid. And we're focusing here on prison cases. So these are departure rates for cases that actually received a prison sentence. Overall, 21% of prison cases got less times than the guidelines recommended, and 3% got more. This slide, as with the last slide, this slide displays the offenses with the highest durational departure rate. Aggravated durational departure rates for were highest for criminal sexual conduct in the 1st and the 3rd degree. Those are the green bars. So you can see those departure rates are quite a bit above the overall average of 3%. At 38%, mitigated durational departures were highest for 1st degree aggravated robbery. Domestic assault and failure to register as a predatory offender also had mitigated durational departure rates greater than 30%. So you see those rates compared to the 21% rate overall. In 67% of all aggravated durational departures, the court stated that the prosecutor agreed to the departure, recommended the departure, or did not object to the departure. In 33% of the aggravated durational departures, the court did not provide information on the position of the prosecutor. There were no cases in which the court stated the prosecutor objected to the aggravated durational departure. In 38% of all aggravated durational departures, the defendant waived their right to jury determination of aggravating factors. In 77% of mitigated durational departures, the court stated the prosecutor agreed to the departure, recommended the departure, or did not object to the departure. In 4% of these cases, the prosecutor objected. Okay, the next slide shows mitigated dispositional and mitigated durational departures by race, ethnicity, and gender, all on the same graph. The blue bars are the mitigated dispositional departure rates, and the green bars are the mitigated durational departure rates for executed sentences. The mitigated dispositional departure rate is high. The blue bars is higher for women than for men. The mitigated dispositional departure rate ranged from a low of 40% for the American Indian and Hispanic categories to a high of 46% for the Asian categories. Recall from the previous slide, the overall mitigated dispositional departure rate was 21%. The mitigated durational departure rate for race and ethnicity varies from a low of 15% for the American Indian category to a high of 32% for the Asian category. The mitigated durational departure rate was higher for males than for females, a reverse of what the dispositional departure rates were. In general, the white category had a higher mitigated dispositional rate than the total rate, but a lower durational departure rate. The black category had a higher mitigated durational departure rate than the total rate, but a lower dispositional rate. The American Indian, Hispanic categories had both lower mitigated durational and dispositional departure rates than the total rate, and the Asian category had both higher mitigated dispositional and durational departure rates than the total rate. Okay, next. This shows departure rates by judicial district. Again, the dispositional departures are in blue, the durational departures are in green. The mitigated dispositional departure rate by district ranged from a low of 29% in the 8th district, which is West Central Minnesota, to a high of 52% in the 6th district, which is the Arrowhead region. Downward durational departures among prison cases range from a low of 5% in the 8th district to 43% in Hennepin County. That's the 4th district. The observed variations may be partly explained by regional differences in case volume, charging and plea practices, as well as differences in the types of offenses being sentenced and the criminal history scores of individuals being sentenced. That completes our presentation. Are there any questions?
Any questions from commission members?
This is a judicial map that's at the end of you. I think you have a copy of the slides. Judicial district map is at the end.
No one with any questions? Commissioner Knudsen.
So thanks, Manager. Just tell me again, this is an annual report that is compiled by the commission, correct?
These are slides from the annual report. The annual report is much longer, and we post it on our website, and we'll let you know when it's up there.
Okay. Do we ever make a special effort to just send this in general out to the district court judges?
I don't know if we ever have or not.
This is really interesting information. gives a perspective of what's happening across the state. And I think it would be interesting for the district court judges to have that rather than trying to direct them to our website once it gets posted.
I know that in the past there have been different task force, like a racial task force, and they have, they have gotten this information from us, and I think they have distributed among their judges. But that was many years ago now, so there's no reason we couldn't.
Yeah. Thank you.
It's a good idea. It's always a good idea to provide information about what's going on with sentencing in the state. Any other questions or comments? All this does is make me want to dig in like 700 different ways.
Yeah. My suspicion is part of the reason that the imprisonment rate, the durations went up, is that the cases that they dropped out of the system in 2020 were the less severe cases. I think my suspicion is they had more cases pleading to misdemeanors, not being sentenced as. I think the number being sentenced as misdemeanors and gross misdemeanors went up, but we can look into that. But we don't know how many were they amended the charge so that it wasn't even a felony charge anymore. My suspicion is that's one of the reasons the cases disappeared. And when we took out the lower level cases, that's one of the reasons the duration went up.
Which, if true, if I may, Madam Chair,
Sure,
it would show up in the 2021 data as a reduction. I mean, and that's, we see that with economic metrics, well, 2020 is high, 2021 is high, 2020 is low, but if you average them, maybe it's, 2 normal years basically. But yeah, but I would say to that though, Anne, is the durations were increasing prior to 2020.
Oh, yes,
It's
yes.
kind of like the mitigated dispositional departure rates and the gap between, I mean, it's basically two sides of the same coin, saying that the mitigated dispositional departure rate is at an all-time high and saying that the gap between the presumptive rate and the actual rate is at an all-time high is really almost saying the same thing. But
I'll put my 2 cents out there that I'm actually really curious to look into is I'm wondering if the drug law changes have also had an effect. I mean, we had such a high volume of 5th degree offenses in our felony count prior to the drug law changes, and a huge chunk of those have been pulled out. And so I kind of wonder if those were pulling the average down. And now and pulling down the presumptive prison rate potentially, I wonder if like pulling them out might have caused the presumptive prison rate to spring up a little bit. That's my theory that I would want to look into. But yeah, I have no idea either.
if I had your staff, Madam Chair.
What'd you say?
There's still a ton of 5th degree drug cases, felonies.
There are still a ton, but they're going to be more subsequent cases, not first timers. They should be anyway.
If I had any idle staff, Madam Chair, I assure you I'd be looking into some of these questions, but we're all pretty fully employed right now.
I hear you.
Yeah. After legislative session, we'll have more time.
For sure. All right. Well, maybe not, because we'll probably keep you busy. All right. Well, thank you for giving us the annual report. Can't wait to see what 2021 looks like in comparison, further down the road. All right, so why don't we move on to the next item on the agenda, which is the sex trafficking review. We were kind of full up last year, so we didn't get to this right away. So today is sort of the initial introduction to this issue, and I will turn it over to Nate to lead us through that discussion.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And you've already given us the introduction, so let me just jump right into the mandate. So this is the mandate that the legislature gave to the commission on, I believe it was the last day of the fiscal year, June 30th of 2021. And that was language that for those who were around during the child porn mandatory review will recognize this language. It was no doubt modeled after that. I guess I don't know that for a fact, but it basically shares the same words. So it's really two parts. One is a comprehensive review, and the second is to consider modifying, based on the results of the comprehensive review, I assume, how the sentencing guidelines and the sex offender grid address the crimes described in Minnesota statute section 609.322, which is essentially sex trafficking. And I would note there's no date on this. So not having a deadline, we kind of, it got a little bit pushed aside last year when we were looking at some more things that were time sensitive. So here's 609.322 in a nutshell. First of all, it has various categories of prohibited behavior, and we call these all sex trafficking. The title of the statute is sex solicitation, inducement, and promotion of prostitution, semicolon, sex trafficking. So here's essentially what's prohibited in that. Soliciting or inducing someone to practice prostitution, promoting the prostitution of an individual, receiving profit known to have been derived from prostitution. And then there's this fourth category called sex trafficking. And frankly, the definition of sex trafficking confuses me a little bit. I'm not sure what's included in sex trafficking that's not otherwise prohibited. I put out here an example: recruiting someone to aid in that person's prostitution is sex trafficking. But to me, the previous definitions are certainly clearer, and maybe somebody who's worked in the field or had to parse this out has more information for me on that. So these offenses do not apply to the person who's being prostituted, nor do they apply to the patron. So we're kind of talking about the pimp in old vernacular. There are two different degrees, and the difference between the degrees is very straightforward. Depending on whether the person who's being prostituted was a child under the age of 18 or was over the age of 18, was an adult. So it's first degree if the person being prostituted was a child, second degree if the person being prostituted is an adult. In addition, there are aggravated circumstances. These circumstances apply both to first and second degree. And I'll talk about the technical organization of that, but here are the aggravated circumstances. If the person had a prior human trafficking offense. So human trafficking is defined as sex trafficking as well as labor trafficking. Second, if the victim suffered bodily harm. Third, if there was debt, if the debt bondage or forced services lasted over 180 days. And finally, if there was more than one victim. So those are the aggravated offenses. So this next slide sort of looks at the statutory structure a little bit in more detail, and also talks about what the sentencing guidelines do. As I said, that's the title of the statute, and you have the language of the statute in your meeting materials if you're interested. So first degree is in subdivision 1 parens A, and that has a 25-year statutory max. Before August 1st, it had, or I should say September 15th of last year, it had a 20-year statutory maximum, but that was changed as part of the same bill that gave you this mandated review. And the guidelines the Sentencing Guidelines Commission did not change the ranking when it considered these changes. It's still ranked at severity level B, and at severity level B, the recommended prison terms are all executed, and they range from 7.5 to 25 years. So it fits now, right? It's now a 25-year statutory maximum, and that's one of the things that we'll talk about the proponent's intent in a minute, but that's one of the things that the proponents were complaining about, is if you've got somebody with a long criminal history, 20-year statutory maximum is lower than the guidelines. The guidelines call for 25 years. We'd like to give the person 25 years, not 20 years. Then second degree, the guidelines did not constrain second degree. That had a 15-year statutory maximum. It's ranked at severity level C, was and is ranked at severity level C, where you've got a 4 to 15-year range of executed imprisonment, but all executed sentences, no probation ever recommended for sex trafficking. And that has a 20-year statutory maximum. It also raised 5 years, although, as I said, the 15-year statutory maximum was really not constraining it. as far as the guidelines were concerned. And so that's in subdivision 1A, not to be confused with subdivision 1 parens A. I say that the organization of the statute is a little bit confusing to me, because then you have aggravated, which is up in subdivision 1 under subdivision 1 clause B, but it applies both to clause A, subdivision 1 clause A, and subdivision 1A. It confuses me every time I say it, but it has a 30-year statutory maximum. So the 30-year statutory maximum does not depend on whether the offense, the underlying offense, is first degree or second degree. Either way, aggravated offenses are the 30-year statutory maximum. That was also raised 5 years from 25 years before September 15th of last year. The sentencing guidelines do not rank this offense, the aggravated offense. Instead, it just adds 4 years to the underlying duration. So if it's first degree, that 7.5 to 25 years becomes, I shouldn't try to, I think it's 11.5 to 29 years, if I did the math on the fly, which is always dangerous. And if it's second degree, then the 4 to 15 years becomes basically 8 to 19 years of recommended, depending on the criminal history score there. And the plus 4 years is half if it's an attempt or conspiracy. So any questions about how this statute is organized? If I can't see you at this point, so I'll assume there aren't if I don't hear anything.
Madam Chair, Commissioner Middlebrook, I have a question for Nate. When was the modifier added? Do you know when that was put into the guidelines?
I think it was all done with the sex offender grid, but I don't know that off the top of my head. Ann May, Ann, would you mind just chiming in whether you do or do not know the answer to that question?
I do not know, but I know it was not there at the beginning because none of these, the whole sex trafficking scheme went into effect after the sex offender grid did. These offenses were not originally on the sex offender grid. All prostitution offenses were on the regular grid when the sex offender grid went into effect. There was no sex trafficking statute then. There was solicitation, inducement, and promotion of prostitution, but it wasn't labeled sex trafficking.
Yeah, which is another thing that we're not. This is the entire scope of this particular mandated review. So looking at how the guidelines treat sex trafficking, I'm sorry, treat other prostitution offenses because they're not contained in this statutory section are not part of your review. I suppose you could look at that. I've always thought it was odd that prostitution of a patron of a child prostitute is not put on the sex offender grid, even though if the person were not paying for the sex, the Same Sex Act would be on the sex offender grid. So let's look at the legislative history. So these are changes from 2 bills last year. And the bill's proponents were the Stearns County Attorney, Janelle Kendall, and the Central Minnesota Human Trafficking Task Force, which is a task force that the Stearns County Attorney's Office is with. And the proponents had legislative handouts, and those handouts are in your meeting materials. And I think those disclose much of the rationale behind the bill. In addition to that rationale that's spelled out there, I've also included some testimony excerpts, some transcripts of Janelle Kendall's excerpts and Ole Tweeden's testimony as it's most pertinent to the, Ole Tweeden is her criminal division head, and those are the excerpts that I thought were most pertinent to you in your consideration of what this mandate is all about. In looking at those documents, you see that proponents argued that sex trafficking is a violent crime. And I shouldn't say that, I don't mean to imply that when they said that they were talking to the commission in any way. They were talking to the legislature and whether it should change the list of violent crimes for which repeat violent crimes receive more severe penalties. The commission has a severe violent offense list as well, which is a subset of the legislature's, well, it's not, I think it's for the most part a subset of the legislature's severe violent crime list. And the commission has its own additional penalty for repeat violent offenders, repeat severe violent offenders, I should say. And it does have labor trafficking on that list, but it does not have sex trafficking on that list. So that may be something the commission might want to explore as part of this review. And I think the commission's decision last year, if I recall correctly, was not to take action at this time, but maybe to look at it in the future. So this would be an appropriate time to look at that now, if that's what the commission's interested in doing. The proponents also wanted to increase the statutory maximums so that the statutory maximums would not cap grid durations, which I've already talked about. The Sentencing Guidelines Commission has already accommodated these changes in the sex offender grid. The only testimony that specifically talked about the review, the oral testimony that talked about this review that's been mandated, was a brief snippet from Ole Tweeden, and he, you can read the transcript, but he seems to be saying that most of what they wanted the commission to consider doing was already done, basically automatically almost, or by the natural reactions that the commission did last year in response to these elevated statutory maximums. But there is a suggested ranking of aggravated sex trafficking at severity level A in the meeting materials. This wasn't testified to directly by the proponents, but maybe that makes sense because the proponents weren't talking to the commission, the proponents were talking to the legislature. And that would be in place of the 4-year modifier. So you'd get some longer durations if it were severity level A rather than as a 4-year modifier. So that would treat aggravated second-degree sex trafficking the same as aggravated first-degree sex trafficking, both at severity level A, which is different from how they're treated now. It's more severe. Aggravated first-degree sex trafficking is more severe than aggravated second-degree sex trafficking. And that's another item that the commission deferred action on pending the outcome of this comprehensive review. So the next steps as I envision it, and this is your study, so you can do what you will with this, would be to review current sentencing practices. So take apart the data, look at offense characteristics and ranking principles, sort of the normal things that the commission looks at when it decides on how to rank an offense. To unpack the severe violent offense list and what's going on with that, and whether sex trafficking fits or does not fit on that list. Perhaps, and that's if the commission wants to do that, perhaps to hear from the bill's proponents. I could see maybe inviting Mr. Tweeden to talk to the commission a little bit about what his experience has been prosecuting these types of offenses and what he thinks the sentencing guidelines ought to look like. And finally, of course, consider possible guidelines modifications. The timeline on this, we don't currently have a December public hearing set, although that's often been the case in recent years, that we do schedule a December public hearing. It would be pretty tight to get all this done in time for a July public hearing. We do have a July public hearing regularly scheduled. That would mean that the commission would have to preliminarily adopt modifications in June, which is just a few months away. And that's all I had on that, Madam Chair. I'm happy to take any questions the commission may have.
So I think my first, well, I guess, first of all, are there general questions that people have on the commission that you'd like to ask at this point? Okay, then my question to the commission is, I think that Nate has laid out a pretty good plan for the way we should tackle this review. And I just would like some feedback from the commission. Does that look like the right plan? Does anything seem to be missing? What are your thoughts there?
Madam Chair, I would just say I think that makes a lot of sense. I'm not looking to change the broaden the scope. I'm intrigued to by the proposition or the question that Nate raised about some of the other sides of that, of the, of this this whole equation, and just at least for us to think about, how a sentencing of non-trafficking cases, but that fall under the other grid. It just to put in context kind of how I know they're different elements, but I do think it would be interesting just to see what that would mean from somebody who, I think you raised the question, and Nate, I think around the solicitation side, if you were the person who was accessing or utilizing somebody who was trafficked, or exploiting somebody who was trafficked, and just some of those things on the other grid. I just think it would be interesting context to see how all of this squares. If that may broaden too much, maybe, but I just wanted to raise the question because I thought it was an interesting question.
I think that's a good point. Do you have any concerns about that, Nate, or is that something you'd want to think about approach?
Well, I don't think, I think there's nothing in this mandate that requires you to look at this, but this is consistent. I mean, expanding it is certainly within your statutory authority. You have the duty to periodically re-examine the sentencing guidelines to make sure that they're still operating the way they should be. And so this, looking at prostitution offenses in general, and I hadn't thought about adult prostitution, frankly, I mean, I kind of get why that wouldn't be a sex offense, because other than the financial transaction, it wouldn't be a sex crime at all. But with children, it always seems strange to me. Like if there weren't the money involved, this would be a sex crime anyway. So why is this on the standard grid? It always seems strange. But I mean, if the commission wishes to look at that, we could certainly look at that. There's nothing untoward about looking into areas that the legislature has not specifically required you to look at.
I think it's helpful, Nate. My thing was, just is there a sense of balance and proportionality when you look at some of these things? Again, not recognizing that they're different at some level, but I do think it's intriguing.
Yeah, and if I could just say one other thing, Madam Chair.
Yes.
As a matter of efficiency, I think if we did sort of double up on this, as long as we're looking at this, I think some of these other areas would fit in quite nicely. So this would probably be as good a time as any to look at prostitution offenses, if that's also within the commission's interest. I guess I have a question for the commission, Madam Chair, if other commissioners don't have questions.
Yeah.
And that is there anybody who thinks that our target should be the July public hearing? Because that would require a pretty aggressive timeline. We'd have to give you a lot of information in the March meeting, for example, if we were shooting for the July public hearing.
Commissioner Larkin.
I don't think we've ever done anything that quickly, and I don't think we could do it that quickly. So I would say no.
I would agree with that.
All right. Well, I am relieved. Thank you.
Sure.
The only other comment I had was that, I think we can sort of see how things play out. I mean, the data, I think, is a great place to start. You had on there the possibility of having the folks who brought this idea forward to the legislature coming to talk to us. And if we do that day, then we might also want to think about if there are other folks that we should invite to talk about this particular issue and give us their feedback on any ranking decisions. So maybe, advocates for who work in this area, or if there's other folks in the system that it might make sense. So I think as we progress along, we should just think about whether there's other people we'd want to hear from as well. Nate?
Madam Chair. Yeah. So, I mean, it occurs to me that if the next step is, and I think, it's always good to start with data, right? If the next step is data, maybe we could include prostitution data, and you could just kind of look at that, and then make a decision at that point, what you want the scope of your further considerations to be.
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
Okay.
All right. Any other questions or comments on this? Great. Well, thanks for kicking us off and getting the process started for us, Nate. I think with that, we can move on to the next item on the agenda, which is the custody status issue. And just for everyone's reference point, this was intended to be sort of a back to basics presentation today. And after we have this presentation that Nate's going to go over, then I would expect a little bit of a discussion on what other information we feel like we want to see as we continue to talk about this issue in the future. So that was really the goal today, is back to basics, and then some more input from the commission on what we need to look at next. So Nate, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I don't mean to sound like a whiner, but we have been pretty strapped this past year, and as a consequence of that, we're all right. Can you see the screen?
Yeah.
Okay. And so as a consequence of that, we've tried to be as efficient as possible with our research resources. So this is essentially a retread of a presentation that we gave to the commission back in, I want to say 2018 or 2017. I actually don't remember which year it was, but it was during the commission's 2-year study of the criminal history score in general. And this is a retread of the commission's look at the custody status point policy. So I thought that would be a good place to start with just kind of showing what we showed the commission back then on the custody status. The data have been updated, however, to reflect current data. As Jill's about to explain on the next slide, however, current data unfortunately does not include data that reflects the 2019 changes. And we'll talk about what some of those changes are in a minute, but the commission made some pretty serious changes to the custody status policy in 2019. And the data that we're going to present to you, unfortunately, just because of how many cases have been sentenced under that policy, does not reflect that. So here's Jill again to kick us off.
Okay, thank you, Nate. The cases in this presentation are arranged into what staff calls guidelines years to better illustrate the impact of any given policy change. Cases are grouped based on offense dates from August 1st to July 31st, and which have been sentenced through 2020. For example, guidelines year 2010 includes cases with dates of offense from August 1st of 2010 to July 31st of 2011 that were sentenced through the end of 2020. With that in mind, this slide shows that the average criminal history score has increased over time from 1.7 in the mid to late 90s to 2.5 by 2018. The average custody status point was 0.3 in 1995 and 0.5 by 2018. The percentage of people who have a 0 criminal history score has gone down over time, from almost half sentenced in 1995 at 47% to 25% in 2018. This slide shows the percentage of people sentenced who were recommended prison under the guidelines displayed by race and ethnicity. The purple line in the middle shows the overall rate, which has gone up from 28% in 1995 to 34% in 2018. The highest rate has been the Black percentage, except for in 1996 and 2001, when the Hispanic percentage was at 39%. The rate has generally gone up for all categories displayed, except that it went up and then back down in the American Indian and Hispanic categories, which both began at 30% in 1995 and went up in 2010 to 36% in the Hispanic category and 37% in the American Indian category, and back down in 2018 to 33% in the Hispanic category and 28% in the American Indian category. In a concept called grid zones, for which we want to give credit to Professor Richard Fraze at the University of Minnesota Law School, Professor Fraze divided Minnesota's grid into 3 zones, which describes the 3 ways people get a presumptive prison sentence. The first is the severity zone, which is illustrated here in blue using the standard grid. A person is recommended prison based solely on the severity level of the offense being above severity level 7. The second zone is the history zone, shown in green, where a person is presumed to go to prison based on their criminal history score. That is to say, a first-time offender would not be recommended to go to prison. And the third zone is the mandatory minimum zone, which is illustrated in gray. And some areas of the grid are presumptive stay, except that there are times the guidelines call for prison because of a statutorily provided mandatory minimum. So an example of that would be a second-degree assault with a weapon. It's a severity level 6 offense, which is in the presumptive stayed severity level, except there's a mandatory minimum that calls for it to be a commitment to prison. The table on the left shows 100% of where people fall 100% of where people fall on the grid by race and ethnicity. You can see from the table that the majority of all 5 categories are presumptive stays, and we'll talk about the presumptive commits in the next slide. Again, looking at zones, but this time only looking at presumptive prison cases. On the far right, we see that for all cases, 59% of presumptive commits were due to history, 23% were from severity level, and 18% were because of mandatory minimums. People who are American Indian were more likely to be presumptive prison because of criminal history at 64%, and people who are Hispanic or Asian are more likely to be presumptive prison because of severity level, and that's at 34% and 32% respectively. Okay, Nate will talk about criminal history components next.
So this is our last slide where we're talking about criminal history score in general, and then we'll focus in on custody status after that. But this is talking about so in guideline year 27, which again, it's guidelines year, which means everybody who was sentenced under the 2017 sentencing guidelines through the end of 2020. So in guidelines year 2017, this is what the average defendant had a criminal history score of a little more than 2.5. And of that criminal history, a little over 2 points were, on average, were contributed by the felony score, the felony portion of the score. So if you were to add up everybody's actual criminal history score, after rounding, you'd end up with 77% of that being felony points. The next largest would be custody status point, which would contribute to 18% of that group's criminal history score, which works out to a little under half a point, which isn't to say they actually got half a point. I don't mean to be confusing with the half-point custody status policy, but if you were to add up everybody's score, that would be the average contribution that custody status would contribute to people's scores. And then misdemeanors and gross misdemeanors, and as well as juveniles, contributed a combined about 5% of the score, about a tenth of a point. So zeroing in now on custody status. So this is a description of the policy. So there's different custody status types, and we'll give you some data on those different custody status types. Probation, parole, supervised release, conditional release, which you see with a lot of sex offenses, release pending sentencing. So you've entered a guilty plea and you're released pending sentencing, and actual confinement naturally is a custody status in a jail, workhouse, or prison if you're pending sentencing or if it's after sentencing. But there has to be a guilty plea, guilty verdict, or conviction there. And it has to be an eligible offense, which is a felony, extended jurisdiction juvenile conviction, EJJ conviction, a non-traffic gross misdemeanor DWI, or related offenses, or a targeted misdemeanor. Targeted misdemeanors are a very select group of misdemeanors that by statute you get booked for if you're arrested on one of these targeted misdemeanors. Those include DWIs, domestic and fifth-degree assaults, and violations of various protective orders. Those are the big ones. There's also interference with privacy and indecent exposure. There are different weights of custody status. Now, there's no custody status weight assigned if the commitment is for treatment or examination under Minnesota Rule of Criminal Procedure 20. Rule 20 governs people whose mental status is in question, and there's a question as to whether they should even be on trial. Then juvenile custody status doesn't count unless it's an EJJ, as we already said. And there are certain misdemeanor, gross misdemeanor DWIs that automatically go into adult court for 16 and 17-year-olds. Those don't count. That's considered juvenile, even though it's technically adult. So there's 1/2 point as of 2019 for being on custody for a felony or EJJ if the severity level is equal to or below 2 on the standard grid or D2 on the drug offender grid. Notice the sex offender grid is not mentioned here, so no sex offenses are eligible for the 1/2 point treatment. Custody status offense was a non-traffic gross misdemeanor DWI, or refusal to test, or reckless driving, or a targeted misdemeanor. So we already saw those on the list. Any of the eligible gross misdemeanors or misdemeanors, those get a 1/2 point if that was the custody offense. So the custody status offense, not the current offense, but the custody status offense, was a low-level felony or a misdemeanor, gross misdemeanor. It counts for 1/2 point, which, as we discussed last month, is now basically being disregarded in the criminal history school. 1 point for all other severity felonies. If it's greater than 2 or D2, or if it's on the sex offender grid, then it gets a point. And there's actually a provision for 2 points if the current offense is on the sex offender grid and the custody status offense is on the sex offender grid. The exception there, though, is failure to register as a predatory offender. That doesn't participate in that 2-point treatment. In addition to the points, regardless of how many points you have, there's a 3-month custody enhancement if a custody status point is assigned and the total criminal history score exceeds the maximum score on the grid. In other words, if your criminal history score is 7 or more, then and one of those points is from a custody status point, then you get a 3-month bump on your presumptive sentence, statutory maximum permitting. This slide shows you a quick overview of some of the changes to custody status policy since 1995. 95 EJJ convictions became an eligible status point, custody status type. 96 supervised release and conditional release became eligible. 2001, within initial probationary period, was an eligible status type. Now that was reversed in 2019, but for that time period between 2001 and 2019, the full period of originally pronounced probation was custody status, even if you got discharged from probation early. That's no longer true. 2002, they added gross misdemeanor DWI, but only for DWI cases. And you see in 2006, just jumping down to that, the gross misdemeanor DWI became an eligible custody status type regardless of the current offense. 2004 was basically clarifying what happens if you are in custody for part of the offense date range, but not the whole thing. You're on custody. Jumping ahead to 2010, targeted misdemeanor convictions became an eligible custody status type. And that was a full point back then. That was changed in 2019. And 2015, gross misdemeanor reckless driving became an eligible custody status type. That was a new offense created in that year. And then 2019 was the big change where the commission took kind of a holistic look at criminal history score. Honestly, the most interesting aspect of the criminal history score was the custody status point to the commission. The commission made a number of different changes to it. It added the half custody status point for less severe offenses. It included a waiver policy for less severe offenses. It reversed that within an initial period of probation, and it said 152.18 stays of adjudication, which had been specifically eligible, are no longer in eligible custody status. you can see that the percentage of people with custody status point has really grown markedly from around 30% back in 1995, 29% to 52% in guidelines year 2018. These are guidelines years, so it really exposes any changes that in policy, what those changes may have impacted the custody status percentage. And I'll just move on. And this shows the percentage of custody status. It's the same information on the previous slide, but broken down by race. You can see that the percentage with custody status does vary by race. It was led by the Black group until 2003, and then the American Indian group took over in 2005 and thereafter. All right, Ann's gonna take over now.
Hello again. This slide shows custody type for the guideline years 2016 to 18, 2006 to 2018 grouped together. So you can see probation was the most frequent custody status type. 78% of the people that got a custody point were on probation. And then parole or supervised release comes next. 13% was from parole or supervised release. Within the original term of probation is the blue line. I'm sorry, that's the next slide.
And let's
Okay.
go ahead and move to the next slide in the interest of time.
Okay. This shows the custody status type by year. You can see it does not vary very much. Probation is the most common type of custody status by every year. The original term of probation what was implemented in 2001. So it's the blue line at the top of these columns, and it's grown a little bit over time. But that was you removed that as an eligible custody status point for offenses on or after August 1, 2019. So it doesn't show up in this data yet. Parole or supervised release makes up between 11 to 15% of the custody status points for those who are Black. At the largest, 11 to 15% of the custody status point. Black offenders had the largest percentage of custody points stemming from parole or supervised release. Probation made up 76 to 79% of the custody types among all races. Release pending sentencing made up between 4 to 5% in all race categories. The original term of probation had been between 2 and 4% in all race categories, but that's, like we just said, that's been eliminated. Conditional release, escape, and other made up negligible amount of the custody status types points, and confined made up between 1 and 2% in all race categories. That's what we have right now for you. So do you have any questions?
Any questions from commission members? Commissioner Larkin.
My question is, I guess, for the chair. Sorry. Where are we going with this? What's the end game here? I mean, we're looking at a lot of data that's 6 to 4 years old, and I appreciate the going back to basics, but given what we went through with the proposal, where are we going from here? And so it's sort of hard to say what data we want, or what do we think of the data, or what questions we have about the data when we don't know what the purpose of all this is. I mean, are we continuing to look at the possibility of completely eliminating the custody point? Are we looking at other ways to deal with the half-point issue? Or are we satisfied that the current temporary fix takes care of the half-point issue? I feel like I need context to know where all this is going before I weigh in on approaches to data.
I guess my answer to that would be I prefer not to have our guidelines operate the way the legislature does, which means that I don't want a provision that's in there that isn't effective. And right now we have a temporary fix that's following case law. we need to fix that provision. So on a long-term basis. So we need to figure out how are we going to adjust that policy going forward to either make it work or make it affect the appellate court's decision or whatever other decision that we choose to make. But I'm not content with allowing case law to drive how the guidelines will be interpreted going into the future. I think we have, I saw Nate go up and then Commissioner Chanel and then Commissioner Larkin. So Nate.
Oh, thank you, Madam Chair. I was just going to make a technical point that, basically the reason I presented this is because the commission last month unanimously decided that it wanted to continue studying the custody status point issue. So that's why I'm bringing it forward.
That is also true. Commissioner Chanel.
Madam Chair, I concur with your comments, but I would also say that, when the motion was made, I think one of the things that was part of that was really an effort to try and do broader engagement, and what that exactly looks like, I'm not sure, but I think, there was a lot of concern about the fact that these things almost happen in a cone, or there's very little broader public engagement, and the public hearing provides some of that, but oftentimes, I think as we heard, that it's meaty, wonky kind of stuff. This whole, the application of that half point, and I was hoping that there would be ways that we could, I think further explore this. One of the things that I'm interested in, that I asked and got some information from the team was some of the average lengths of what does custody status actually mean when you apply that to actual extended periods of incarceration, and because I think it's helpful context. So I'd like to look at that and make sure that people understand exactly what are we talking about? What are the implications of custody status, and to what extent does that serve the state's penal interest? And so I'm with you that I hope we can continue to engage in the conversation.
Commissioner Larkin.
Yeah, and Nate, thank you for providing the data. I'm not criticizing you for doing that. I'm just looking for guidance. I mean, so are we going forward examining and educating the public about the possibility of completely eliminating the custody point? Or are we sort of back to where we were last year at this time, where we're exploring all options for resolving the half point dilemma? That's what my confusion is.
Well, I think at the last hearing, I made it clear that I still support eliminating custody status, and my thoughts haven't changed on that in the past month, but I am one member of this commission. I am not the whole commission. So yes, all options are on the table, and I hope that we can develop a resolution. I would prefer if we could reach consensus on a resolution, but I can't predict today where we will end up. And so I do want everyone on this commission to be thinking about what the options are and what information would you need to know to evaluate those the potential ways that we could adjust the policy. Commissioner Moore.
Thank you, Madam Chair. One thing that I've discussed with Director Wrights is the question of data related to the waiver, the provision that the custody of the custody status point that was added by the Sentencing Guidelines Commission in 2018, I believe. And I don't know if that data is being collected. I don't know if judges are telling the Guidelines Commission if they're waiving the custody status point or not. But if we're able to get that data, I think that could give us some indication of how the district courts are using it and applying it, and what factors are being considered is important there.
Yeah, and Nate, I think that you can get that, right? I mean, I guess each time someone brings up data, it's up to you to tell us what's possible and what's not, and what is going to be feasible given your staffing.
So thank you, Madam Chair and Justice Moore. So two things. One is the reason we only went through guidelines year 2018 isn't because we're chicken to talk about guidelines year 2019, although it does add a lot of wrinkles, including the ambiguous half-point policy and what did that actually mean. But it's because there just haven't been enough cases sentenced. So the offense date has to be on or after August 1st of 2018, and the sentence date has to be by December 31st of 2020 to be in our complete data set. So we didn't have enough cases to meet the threshold of what we would normally consider to be a guidelines year. In other words, I think it's 50% in that calendar year have to be sentenced within that guidelines year. So in 2020, most of the cases occurred before August 1st of 2018, if that makes sense. And please correct me if I'm wrong. So we do have some data, but it's not necessarily that much data. The second qualification that particularly goes to waiver. So that goes to, the first thing I said has to do with all policy changes that were made in 2019. I'm not entirely certain. We have a suspiciously low number of cases to look at with respect to waiver. And I'm a little suspicious about the data, Justice Moore. I'm not sure if judges always reported waiver or if it was just deleted from the sentencing worksheet and we didn't know about it. We do have data. I hope it's good data. It's not very much data and it's a suspiciously low number. So we'll certainly be happy to present what we have. I wish I could tell you with great confidence that it was a complete data set.
Can I ask you to clarify that? Are you saying that the sentencing worksheet does have a place to indicate waiver, but isn't the sentencing worksheet completed by someone in corrections, not the court? Are you talking about a departure worksheet?
I'm gonna phone a friend on this one, please. Ann or Jill?
The sentencing worksheet does collect whether or not the custody status point was waived. That is true. So we are collecting that data. I think what you were saying is that sometimes it's not necessarily there may not be a worksheet that was presented to the court. The court may say that they're waiving the custody status point at the time of sentencing, and then it's just never indicated on the worksheet. That is done post-sentence. So I think those are some of your suspicions about the data.
So just so I can clarify, just tell me if I'm right on the order of things. The sentencing worksheet is usually prepared and provided to the court before sentencing, but waiver might be decided at that sentencing hearing. And we just may never get back around to adding that information to the sentencing worksheet.
Yes.
That's kind of what I'm hearing you say.
That is correct.
Thank you. Ann?
Ann,
Oh,
you're
you're
on
on
mute.
mute.
A large number of cases from some large counties get sentenced without a worksheet. We sent out departure reports for all the cases sentenced in 2020. And we got back some responses saying that it wasn't a departure because they waived the custody status point. So of course, then we went and, took the custody status point up. We noted that, but we didn't know that until the departure report came back to us saying that's why it wasn't really particularly a durational departure.
Got it. Commissioner Larkin.
Thank you. Again, just looking for more guidance from the chair. I appreciate that you're only one voice and that you favor elimination of the custody point, but we're coming from a very recent vote where a majority of the commission favored elimination of the custody point altogether. And what I'm struggling with when we're asked what kind of data do we want so we can figure out where to go next, I mean, it seems to me we've got a philosophical divide. Do we want to keep the custody status point or not? And I don't know how data informs that decision. It seems to me to be a philosophical decision where people are either going to agree or not agree. And I don't know, I don't collect data. Maybe there's data that would cause you to go from one side of the equation to the other, but I'm not sure what that would be. I mean, when I think of what data do I want to make a decision, I just seem to come at it differently than the group perhaps, because I say, okay, what policy change are we considering? The data I would want to see is, okay, what impact will that policy change have on sentences in terms of raising sentences, lowering sentences, prison beds, etc. So I feel like we're putting the cart before the horse to say, well, what data do you want? I feel like we need to have some sort of consensus on a policy change that would be agreeable to everyone, and then we would take a look at whether the data supports it. And perhaps that's the wrong way to go about it, but that's simply what I'm struggling with and why I raise it.
Commissioner Morath.
Coming from someone who personally I fall somewhere in the middle, and some of the data that I would like to see and have some clarification on in order to make a more informed decision are things like measuring the type of reoffense. Are we talking technical recidivism or a true new offense, as well as breaking it down by the custody type. Just doing a preliminary literature review on more of a national level, while it's sparse, it seems that other researchers have found statistical significance when breaking down that regression analysis further. And then there can be a philosophical debate, of course, on what those findings mean, but I feel that that would provide a more complete data set in order to make informed decisions personally.
Just a moment, Judge Larkin. So just to clarify, so you want to know sort of what types of these are all people who are coming back with a new felony, right? So what you're asking for is sort of what types of felonies are they committing this time around? The people who have custody status, so they've clearly committed something before. What are they committing now? Is what I think I'm hearing you say. Is that correct?
Yes, as well as the custody status type classification.
Okay. Commissioner Larkin. Oh, and then I'm sorry, Commissioner Larkin, and then Middlebrook, and then Estrada.
And thank you for that clarification, because I thought I heard, was it a technical violation? We're not talking about probation revocations, technical violations. All of these people getting a custody point have committed a new felony, so it's a new offense, and conviction of new offense and sentencing on new offense. So that narrows it.
Okay. Commissioner Middlebrook.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I know we had that the chart that was the heat grids, basically, that kind of showed who was getting the custody status point. Is it possible to get more in-depth data on that, which may also go to some of what Commissioner Morath is asking, would like to see? I don't know, and maybe the staff can indicate if that's too much, or if we could get a breakdown on that as far as the number of cases and the type of cases, so we would have more than just that graph.
Nate, do you want to respond to that at all? Or I should have asked you to respond to both. That I think that is similar to what Commissioner Morath is asking for.
Well, that sounds easier than what Commissioner Morath was asking for, but I mean, yeah, I think there are a lot of interesting questions in there. I'm not sure. I mean, personally, I'd be interested to know, like, what did the custody status look like? Was it just, call in when your number comes up, or was it actually, meeting with a probation agent and doing an active probation? But I don't know how we would ever quantify that. The similarity between the custody offense and the current offense, I think, would be interesting. I don't know how much we can get on that, but
Okay. Commissioner Estrada.
Commissioner Morath beat me to the punch. I was going to ask for something similar, so thank you for that. I believe that when we were looking at length of probation and putting a cap on the length of probation, one of the things we looked at was recidivism rates and when people are more likely to recidivate. I believe it was like the first 7 months, and if somebody goes, 2 years without recidivating, their likelihood of recidivate is as if somebody had zero criminal history. So I think that would be helpful to know as well, as what Commissioner Morath noted, what is the new offense that they're committing. I think that came up a lot in the public hearing, under the assumption that it's, violent crimes that people are continuing to commit and things of that sort. I think it would be helpful to know what are the new offenses and what people are on supervision for. Commissioner Larkin, I do hear your concern, and I don't see the two as separate. I see the option of eliminating the custody status point as one way of resolving the issue of the half custody point. I also still support that. However, that being said, I also, really read the suggestion that you made in terms of what data you would like to see. And if data is presented that may give me pause, that might change a whole nother outlook and encourage some collaboration and some new brainstorming. But I don't think that we should say like, yes, elimination is off the table and so we're going to move to this, because I do see elimination of the custody status point as one option of how we can deal with the half custody point.
Commissioner Ladd.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to come at this kind of really sort of basic, like, well, we started this a long time ago, is when we talked about, we had this problem with the half custody status point and we have a rounding problem. And when we started talking about the rounding rule and the rounding rule applying to the felonies and that sort of thing. And I would be curious to know, with a data set, and we call it custody status because you have that designation for being supervised in some sort. And if you have that designation, you automatically, whatever your criminal history score is, it gets rounded up. So if you're at 2.5, you become a 3. If you don't have that designation and you're at 2.5, you're a 2. Now, depending on the type of offense you have, both of those might still be presumed stays. I would like to see if we looked at, and I think to Commissioner Middlebrook's point, when we talked about that heat zone on sort of where you go across the line for commits versus not, and what we're talking about. But I do think that the kind of offense that people are on probation for and their criminal history score, if they're being supervised, if we're rounding up or rounding down, I think that's relative to what we're talking about here. And it would apply equally across the state, no matter where people are found in whatever court they're in whatever county or jurisdiction. And so I don't know if we can take current numbers and just look at like what the numbers would look like if we rounded up versus what we rounded down, and what the net impact would be for population, for prison, not prison, and the various demographics. But we started out with this whole thing looking at trying to fix the rounding problem. And we keep talking about a half a point, which what happened as a result of the commission's work in 2019. But if we round up or round down, given the designation that someone's being supervised or not, I think that addresses one of the concerns that I have, is that people are more culpable or should be more culpable and held more accountable for their conduct and their behavior because they are being supervised. And so rounding up would give them that designation. Now, one of the things that came out at our last meeting was that for some people, it doesn't change anything. They're still on the presumed side and it doesn't really do anything. They just have a longer presumed state sentence. That's true. But that changes as they go along if they continue to be repeat offenders. But we don't know that. We don't have a crystal ball when we're doing these things, but it is something that's objective and it would apply equally to everybody. So I would like to look at how we could examine if we were rounding up or rounding down with the designation of somebody being subject to supervision. And I don't exactly know how we could crunch those numbers, but I'd like to see if we could try to do something along those lines.
Can I ask for some clarification on that?
Sure.
So are you talking about the felony points, rounding the felony points up or down based on whether so it's not like there's a separate custody status that gets added to the score. It's that when you come to that point for rounding the felony points, you would either round up or round down based on this type of status.
Correct. And so we would get rid of, we wouldn't be calling it custody status point per se, but it would, I guess, maybe function that way. But the idea is we would just take whatever their felony criminal history score is, and if they're subject to supervision, they get their criminal history points round up for the purpose of the current offense. If they don't have supervision, then their points round down like it currently is. And I know that seems somewhat elementary, but I'd be curious to see sort of what the net effect would that be, but it would be applied equally to everyone. And I do think it holds what I would say repeat offenders more accountable and keeps it, they're more culpable, and there is something there. And again, if they're low level offenders, it might not mean a lot in terms of consequences because they just have a longer state sentence, but it could be for some folks in that heat zone on the grids that it could bump them over into a presumed commit. That's true. But I think it's objective and I think it's fair. And so I would like to look at that.
Okay. Commissioner Larkin?
And I appreciate the simplicity of that solution, but I think that's the solution we rejected based on the sole public comment we had from Professor Fraze. And to this day, is it Fraze or Frazee, Madam Chair?
It's Fraze.
Fraze. And the problem with that approach, I think, is that it doesn't treat everyone the same. Because if your criminal history score based on felonies, juvenile, EJJ, gross misdemeanor points ends up at 3.5, and you are on custody supervision when you get a new offense, you go up and you get an additional consequence potentially as a result of your custody status. But if you're a 3.5 and you're not on custody status, you go down, so then you're not getting it. But what if you're at a 3? So do you see what I mean? It's like, what if somebody has a whole number criminal history score and they're on custody status, nothing happens to them. And I think that was the whole problem with approaching this from a rounding perspective. We were having sort of an arbitrary outcome in that whether or not you got bumped up to a higher consequence based on your custody status depended solely on whether you had a whole number or a half number on your criminal history score. And that seemed like a completely arbitrary way to do it. I think that, maybe one thing we could talk about, especially when we mentioned the heat map and where these offenses, where the custody status or the custody point is imposed and for what type of offenses is, and these are discussions we started to have last year, are there some level of offenses that are so low that we don't even give a custody point if you commit that offense? Are there some people who, given the offense for which they're on probation, it's so serious that we don't care how low the new offense is, they should get a custody status consequence? I mean, it seems to me if we're going to play with this, we should sort of look at what you're on probation for, how many priors you have, and what's the severity of the new offense. And I don't know that there's sort of a one size fits all where we could say, well, if your new offense is at the bottom 2 rungs of the grid, you don't get any custody consequence, because it seems that if for some reason you're on a real high level offense and you got a dispositional departure, you should be on your best behavior. And we would assume that somebody who has a high level offense is getting an intensive level of probation. So even if they just commit a 5th degree drug case, maybe they should get a custody point. I mean, I think it's very complicated, and I almost think we need to have those sorts of discussions and then say, okay, what does the data tell us about this approach and how sentences would look if we took this approach?
All right, so in the interest of time, that's a very good point. In the interest of time, we'll wrap up the discussion for this month. I do think that the request has been made to sort of look at what people were committing this time and maybe what type of custody status they were on, it starts to get at what you were saying, what you were talking about, Judge Larkin. So it probably makes sense if staff can pull that together, that we start to look at that. But then I think we need to keep these kinds of discussions going about, so what other angle, how else do we want to look at this, and what do we want to talk about? Judge Larkin, did you have a quick thought? I just want to
quickly. I don't want staff to pull any data based on what I just said, because I'm just not doing a good job of expressing this. I think we have to first say, all right, here's a policy change that might be palatable, and then say, what would the data look like if we did this? To simply say, yeah, pull data on this and that. Well, I don't know that that allows people to say, well, am I willing to say I'd forego a custody point in certain circumstances? For me to answer that question, I'm not just going to look at the data and say, well, here's what it shows about who's getting it and who's not, therefore I'm willing to forgive it in these circumstances. I think it's sort of a broader inquiry from a policy perspective of who should be getting a custody point and who shouldn't. And I think we have that discussion first instead of just making the policy fit the numbers, if that makes sense.
Right. I understand what you're saying. I think I sort of disagree. So we'll just leave it for that. We'll leave it there for now because we're almost out of time. Executive Director's report.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I've got 3 items that I listed here on the Executive Director's report. The first is has to do with requests for departures in half custody status point cases. So it's really a question of, so each year, well, periodically, when judges depart from the sentencing guidelines, they're supposed to submit to us a reason for their departures, or the record that explains the reason for the departures. And oftentimes they don't, and so we follow up with them. We send them a request for departure reasons. And I guess we're really struggling with, what do we do in these half-point cases if the judge has departed, so say they've given a more severe sentence than would have been called for under the commission's guidance of last month to essentially always round down the half point, but they didn't. They added it up and said, hey, this is what I think it is. Do we ask for a departure report in those cases, or is that do we just say, well, the policy was ambiguous at that time, there really wasn't a clear reason? We did have these non-precedential opinions from the Court of Appeals that indicated he should round down, but it wasn't necessarily crystal clear, and the commission and staff really weren't giving much in the way of clear guidance there. So do we essentially ding these judges with a departure in those cases, or do we and ask them for a reason, and they can go tell us this wasn't a departure, which we get that quite a bit. And usually we're pretty confident in saying, no, this was a departure. Here, I think my confidence level is pretty low. So I'm not sure what we should do, if we should just not do a departure report request, or if we should, based on the commission's guidance as articulated last month, or if we should only do it for sentences that were made on or after the date of the commission's last meeting. So I guess any guidance for your poor staff would be much appreciated at this point. Or we table it and discuss it as a full-blown agenda item at a future meeting.
I'm wondering, okay, so I think the best case scenario would be that we would find a way to track what actually happens in the court, and that we would find a way to request that information from judges, and also communicate that we're not necessarily calling this a departure. We're trying to understand the actual sentencing that occurred last year and what it was based on, whether it was based on counting this as rounding up this sentence or rounding it down. I'm just wondering, is there some way we can asterisk these cases and still get the information from judges so that we can get a clear picture of what happens?
Yeah, perhaps so. That may be the answer. Any other feedback?
I mean, they'd still have to fill out a departure report probably. But you know, it's sort of the way you ask for that information. If you make it more clear that not necessarily going to be called one. Yeah, I don't know. What other folks think? Commissioner Middlebrook.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I will just tell you that we're filing a lot of post convictions and motions to get sentences corrected based on that. But, you know, that's just more informational.
That's helpful. And sometimes we get that too, that it's not a departure because we fixed it later. Sometimes they fix it when they find out that it's a departure from us and they, oops, didn't mean to do that, and they correct the sentence. All right, so my next 8B has to do with demographic impact statements. So as some of you know, the staff at the Commission's direction prepares demographic impact statements for bills that are pending in the legislature. Basically, the requirement is, first of all, we have to have gotten a fiscal note request, which probably means the bill has some legs to it. We wouldn't get a fiscal note request presumably if it had no interest at all in leadership. Second, there has to be a particular measure of impact. So it has to have either a plus or minus change in prison beds of 10 beds or a plus or minus change in felons of 50 felons each year. If it meets those significance criteria, then we prepare a demographic impact statement if we can. Sometimes we can't. Sometimes we just don't have, we have the data to make an estimate about the impact, but we just don't have any data about, we know it's going to be a 10-bed cost, but we don't know who the occupants of those 10 beds, what they're going to look like at all. We don't have any basis for that, but often we do, and we can do a demographic impact statement. So A, that's happening. That's a thing. B, we are going to be preparing them. There's at least two bills that we've done fiscal notes on so far where it's definitely more than meeting that significance threshold, and I'm sure we're going to be able to complete a demographic impact statement. There's a third bill that probably meets the threshold, but I don't think we're going to be able to complete a demographic impact statement on. So I want to let you know that, first of all, you have a right as a commission under your policy to participate in that process if you want to. So we will be sending out notices to you to say, hey, there's going to be a demographic impact statement. If you want to participate in the actual creation of the demographic impact statement, that is to say you get to review it before we submit it to the legislature, you would want to respond affirmatively to an email like that I'll be sending you to say, hey, we're doing a demographic impact statement. So that's one point. The other point has to do with who we give it to. So right now under the policy, we give it to the chairs of the crime committees. I had an author of a bill complain to me, hey, I didn't know that there was a demographic impact statement prepared on my bill until I read it in your report to the legislature in January. And I said, good point. So I think what I would like to do, what I told the author is I would give him, I would give the authors of bills demographic impact statements. There's nothing in the policy that prohibits that. So in addition to the chairs, I'm also going to include the authors. But if there's any objection to that, I'd be happy to. I'm just letting you know that that's my intention, but it doesn't have to be that way. And we do end up posting them on our website anyway.
Commissioner Knudsen.
Yeah, so the fiscal impact, any kind of impact like this, it seems to me that we would provide that to the ranking a minority member, the chair, and the author. At a minimum of all three of those should have that information so they can adequately respond and deal with the impact that we're suggesting that bill might have.
If I may respond to that, Madam Chair.
Yeah, go ahead.
So the policy was sort of a document that was written by committee, if you will, and I probably would have included that myself if I were writing the policy from scratch. But that's not what it says right now. It just says the chairs. I'd be happy. I mean, if there's no objection, I'd be happy to do exactly what Commissioner Knudsen has said. I think that makes a lot of sense, actually.
I do too, and I wonder if we should, like, maybe informally, maybe we could do a motion today to that effect, and maybe we could have you bring the policy back and just look at amending it formally at a future meeting, if anyone is willing to make that motion.
Well, Madam Chair, I'll make the motion that any a demographic impact statement, bed impact statement, that we provide in response to legislative proposals be provided once the bill is introduced, though. Once the bill is introduced to the chair, the ranking minority member, and the bill author.
And Madam Chair, I'm sorry,
Go ahead.
I think Ann has something
Yeah,
for
the
it.
same thing you were going to say. We are part of the fiscal note system, so all legislative staff and members have access to that. So it's just that these demographic impacts aren't part of the fiscal note. So the fiscal note has the bed impact and the dollar cost, and that goes to everybody. We're just talking now about the additional demographic impact statement that they won't let us put on the fiscal note system.
Oh,
Yeah, because it's
thank
just
you very much.
it's our creature, Judge Knutson. It's not something that's there's not an official system for it, so it's just something we made up. But legislators do find it helpful.
So I assume with that you amend your motion to just cover the demographic impact statement, Commissioner
Correct.
Knudsen?
Yes,
Okay.
thank you.
And do we have a second for that motion?
I have a point of procedure. If we're raising a motion, is this intended as an action item today? Because I
Yes,
don't
but
think we can have an action item unless the issue has been discussed at a previous meeting, right? Under our rules, Nate?
Well, that actually has to do with guidelines changes. This isn't a guidelines change,
Oh,
so
okay.
it's I guess it's up to. I mean, I think there's a grounds to complain, but I mean, it's curious to me because it's essentially changing the policy. So it's sort of a temporary change of policy pending final change of the policy at a
I think
future meeting.
it's direction to you, and then we're gonna bring the policy back at the next meeting and formally decide if we're gonna do that all the time. That sound good?
Okay.
That's what I was thinking.
I do
Do
have
we have a
another
second?
question. I think the executive director said there are 3 bills at this point which warrant the preparation of those impact statements. Could he tell us what those bills are?
I'd be happy to, Madam Chair. So and actually I was going to get to that in my.
Let's hold off on that real quick. Can we take care of this motion first, and then we can talk about that when he talks about the legislative update? Do we have a second on the motion? To provide the demographic impact statement, not only to the chairs of the 2 committees, but also to the ranking minority members and the authors of the bills.
I'll second.
Commissioner Moore seconds. Any discussion? Okay, hearing none, let's go ahead and vote on that.
To the Knutson motion to permit staff to provide demographic impact statements to the ranking minority members and bill authors as well as chairs. Estrada?
Yes.
Estrada, yes. Blakey?
Yes.
Blakey, yes. Hansi?
Yes.
Hansi, yes. Knutson?
Yes.
Knutson, yes. Ladd?
Yes.
Ladd, yes. Larkin?
Yes.
Larkin, yes. Middlebrook?
Yes.
Middlebrook, yes. Moore?
Yes.
Moore, yes. Morath?
Yes.
Morath, yes. Schnell? Schnell?
Sorry, yes.
Schnell, yes. Chair Mitchell?
Yes.
Chair Mitchell, yes. Madam Chair, there are 11 votes in favor, no votes opposed.
Okay, with that, it passes unanimously. And then your last item was the legislative update, and if you could cover which bills you're going to be dealing with the demographic impact statements, that would be great. Thanks.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I can't remember what the third bill was. So we've had, I'll tell you, I know what the 2 eye-popping bills are in terms of bed impact, and those both have to do with Minnesota Statute 60911. So 60911 deals primarily with gun offenses. It's basically a small list of crimes that, if committed with guns, require a mandatory minimum penalty. One of those is second-degree assault, which is always committed with a dangerous weapon. So 60911 always applies because it's either a dangerous weapon, which has a smaller mandatory minimum, or a firearm, which has a larger mandatory minimum. It also applies to possession of a firearm by somebody who's committed a crime of violence, which is really where most of the bed impact comes. So what the bill does, well, one of the bills makes all these mandatories, which are now what we call soft mandatories, meaning that they are waivable by the judge, or the prosecutor can ask the judge to waive. Those are going to become, under the bill, hard mandatories, which means they're not waivable. So we're assuming that all those prison terms will be imposed and executed as required by law. And we're looking at a bed impact of, we're thinking over 1,000 beds for that bill. The second version of the bill is the same, except it does not apply, the hard mandatory does not apply to a weapon other than a firearm, a dangerous weapon other than a firearm. So if it's a second-degree assault with a knife, for example, there would still be a waivable mandatory minimum that would apply. So those are certainly going to be qualify for the demographic impact statement, and I think we're going to be able to provide a demographic impact statement because we know exactly who is getting those departures now, and they will all not get departures. So we will be able to, I think, pretty precisely tell you who the occupants of those beds are going to be. Dang, I just can't remember. There was another one where we were, let's see. So I'll tell you one. So carjacking. So there's a bill out there that would take robberies, and if the robbery property that was stolen as part of the robbery was a motor vehicle, then it would create a higher statutory maximum penalty, and then it would impose on that a mandatory minimum, a hard mandatory minimum on top of the higher stat max. So that bill, we don't know exactly which robbery offenses involve property. We just don't have the, I'm sorry, don't involve automobiles. We just don't have that data. We have some data from the BCA that we can sort of assume that a proportion of those involve cars, but we don't know which particular cases. And without knowing which particular cases are being elevated in severity, we don't know which particular defendants are being elevated in severity. So we don't know who the occupants of the prison beds are. So that's sort of an illustration of a demographic impact statement, where we would write up a memo explaining why we can't do a demographic impact statement rather than providing a demographic impact statement.
Commissioner Larkin, did you have a quick comment?
On that, yeah, and I'm not, I think I know the answer to this, but maybe Commissioner Middlebrook or Commissioner Ladd could correct me. So in Minnesota, we either have felony theft of a motor vehicle or aggravated robbery. We don't actually have a crime called carjacking, right? So what they're trying to do here is to single out aggravated robberies.
Right. The elements are identical.
Okay.
The elements are identical to the three forms of robbery. It's just an additional element of the property stolen was a motor vehicle. It gets you 5 years of additional penalty and a mandatory minimum.
You're never going to be able to calculate that if we don't have the crime, right?
Well, we've gotten some statistics from the BCA, and this is getting a little under the hood of what we do every day, but we've gotten some statistics from the BCA on how many robberies were reported to police that were in 2021 that were where the property stolen was a car. And so we're taking that percentage. It's actually a pretty high percentage, and we're applying that percentage to our sentencing data from 2019 on robberies, and basically assuming, and it's not a precise assumption, but I think it's helpful to give the legislature what information we do have. We're assuming that you're going to apply that percentage to those robbery cases, and it's that percentage to which the new mandatory minimums, and we're also assuming that you're going to elevate the rankings based on the fact that the legislature increased the statutory maximum and so forth. So all that will total up to a bunch more prison beds.
Commissioner Middlebrook, did you have a quick comment, or are you good?
Yeah, thanks, Madam Chair. I was gonna ask the director. I don't know, does it help if you look at the numbers under the enhanced penalties of subdivision 3A of 609.52? I don't know. That was one of the bills that we were looking at too. So I didn't know if that would be, if that data was available, if that would give you any kind of projection.
We would have the data to be able to say what proportion of permanent theft cases involved, that is theft under 69522A1, what percentage of those involve motor vehicles, because we track that because that's a different severity level. I just don't know that that's necessarily a fully valid comparison. I think the better data are looking at the robbery. So those would just be robbery complaints. They're not necessarily even arrests, right? It's just people who say, hey, I got robbed. And then they write down, okay, what was your car? What was your property that you got stolen? And if they say car, they make a note of that. And then we apply that percentage. It's not necessarily the same thing as cases that got closed, and cases that got charged, and cases got convicted, and cases got sentenced. Not necessarily the same thing, but I think I think it's probably more accurate because you're talking about robbery and robbery than it would be talking about theft and theft. I just don't know that there's those pie charts are going to look the same with respect to cars being stolen. Particularly, I mean, you think about
I'm gonna let you and Commissioner Middlebrook hash this out later. Just because we're over time, do you have anything else you want to tell us real quick?
I do. Just a couple more things on so that's kind of on the crime side of what's going on in the legislature. There's also stuff going on with you. So changes with respect to 24409, I just want to tell you about. And that's typically what I try to focus on are big crime bills in my legislative updates, and also things that particularly affect the commission. So at the first meeting of the Senate Judiciary Committee this year, the committee took up, so Senator Limmer's committee took up, I'm sorry, that's Senate Judiciary, if I didn't say that, took up two bills. The only two bills at the first meeting, both had to do with the Sentencing Guidelines Commission. One was the bill that he's previously introduced that would make the appointed members of the commission subject to senatorial confirmation. Although that was amended to only include the gubernatorially appointed members of the commission. So the judicially appointed members are exempt. And when I say appointed members, I'm accepting out Commissioner Schnell and Justice Moore, who are either ex officio members or designated by an ex officio member. And that did clear the Senate Judiciary Committee. It did clear the Government Operations Committee and State Government Committee as well. Also, I'm pleased to report was a bill to make the 5 analysts on the staff classified employees. That was also heard by Senator Limmer, who authored the bill, for which I'm grateful. And he that also cleared the committee unanimously on a bipartisan basis, I should add. And I should also say that Senator Limmer said some very kind things about the analysts on your staff. And I said some kind things as well. I mentioned that basically my job number one was not to screw up the excellent reputation that your staff have when I took this job. And Senator Limmer said that essentially they're some of the best, if not the best, state employees out there. So, and I heartily concur with that message. There are other bills out there, including a bill that would, I think at the most extreme, would abolish the Minnesota Sentencing Guidelines Commission, authored by none other than Senator Ingebrigtsen, who is a former alumnus of the Minnesota Sentencing Guidelines Commission, interestingly enough. But it would abolish it. I should say it would abolish you. It wouldn't necessarily abolish the staff. It would convert the staff into a data agency only. So essentially keep the Clearinghouse and Information Center mission going, but get rid of the guidelines side of things. The policy side. That concludes my report, Madam Chair. Thank you for your indulgence.
All right. I think we should move on to public comment.
All right. Members of the public, in a moment, your microphones will be unmuted, which means that we're going to be able to hear what you have to say. If you do not wish to make a comment or you don't want us to hear what you have to say, please immediately remute your microphone to reduce feedback and to preserve your own privacy. If you do wish to make a comment, please state your name and the chair will call on you. Give me just a moment, please, to unmute the microphones. All right, I am now unmuting your microphones.
My name is William Johnson. I live in Maple Grove. I'm 78 years old.
All right, Mr. Johnson, if you could just hold on. We're going to see if anybody else has any comments as well. All right, I see a couple of microphones that have not been unmuted, but I'm not hearing anybody's names. So I am going to manually mute those microphones, Madam Chair, if you're okay with that.
Yes. All right, Mr. Johnson, please go ahead.
Going on, giving my short bio who I am. I really was surprised at how well thought out this meeting was. It was really a pleasure to watch it. I would like to talk to the director a few minutes afterwards about how I could obtain information on the meeting, whether it's video recorded or meeting materials. That's about all I'm asking. Thank you.
All right, well, thanks for coming today. I'm going to let Director Wrights talk about the website just real quickly, and then if you two need to connect later on, you can.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Madam Chair. I'm sorry. Mr. Johnson, the meeting materials are posted on the website. I think there may have been a mistake on the meeting materials from council and state governments. It may have been an older version of that, so we'll get that fixed tomorrow. But the meeting materials are all there on your website, and there's a link on that website to our YouTube channel where you'll be able to see the video of this meeting. I think it's tomorrow that'll be posted as well.
All right, and I assume that you can also reach out to staff and call us additional questions if you have any. All right, so that brings us to the end of the meeting today. I don't think we're certain yet on the format that our meeting will take next month, but we'll be letting you know that as soon as we can, unless I'm incorrect about that. And then if there's no other business today, then I will adjourn the meeting. Oh, Commissioner Larkin?
Just a quick question on format. If we do go back to in-person hearings, isn't there a way for a particular commissioner to participate by phone? I think we've done that in the past, right? If somebody can't be there?
Yes,
Okay.
that's right. There is a rule that governs that. But there's special rules that govern access on both ends of that equation. So I think Nate would have to walk you through that.
So essentially, Madam Chair and Judge Larkin, that's what we were doing from July to last meeting. That's essentially a hybrid meeting, and we do have to provide notice of that to the public. That's 10 days advance notice. So if we do choose to do that going forward, if that becomes the norm, we could do that. That's I think really up to the chair and the commission as to whether they want to make that the norm going forward. We can accommodate that, but we just need to know well in advance of the meeting if that's true, if it's going to be that hybrid format, because we have to give the public 10 days notice.
Yep. Okay. All right. Well, thanks everyone for coming today. Stay safe, and we will see you next month. The meeting is adjourned.
Thank you.
Thanks.